Hello everybody, if you can believe it, we've reached the end, or near enough, of the first month of 2024, so of course that means it is time for the Patreon Drydock, episode 283. So let's just get stuck in with the questions, shall we? There's quite a few of them. Texas and La Choc asks, in the US Navy's hull classification system, fleet carriers and light carriers share a number sequence, as do light and heavy cruisers. But escort carriers and large cruisers had their own sequences. What determined if a variant of a hull type was sequenced in an existing line or was given a new one? I think it's a mixture of role and legacy. So when you look at, for example, the Independence class, the light fleet carriers and the fleet carriers, fundamentally they are supposed to be doing the same thing. They are fleet carriers, whether they're light or larger ones. And when you look at the existing line of US fleet carriers at the time that they ordered the Independence class, you've got everything from the Lexingtons all the way down to Wasp and Ranger via the Yorktowns, and then of course the Essexes are coming on as well. So when you say look at Ranger, displacement wise, Ranger's actually much closer to an Independence class than she is to a Lexington, or even to a certain extent a Yorktown. And when you look at the design history of the Independence class, remember they were ordered to supplement the frontline carrier strength when they thought they weren't going to get the Essexes online quite as quickly as they historically did. So them sharing a sequence number with, if you like, the regular fleet carriers makes perfect sense, because they're all pretty much doing the same job at varying degrees of size. Whereas the escort carriers are explicitly not capable of standing in the front line of battle alongside the bigger carriers, because for one thing, they just flat out cannot keep up. They're supposed to be for, well, as the name suggests, escort purposes, and so with a very different mission profile, they sort of merit their own sequence. And similarly with light and heavy cruisers, remember when you're building the Omahas and then the Pensacola's and the Northamptons, at that point, there is no distinction between heavy and light cruiser. They're just all cruisers. So they're all getting sequenced numbers because it's just the cruiser role. It's only with the First London Naval Treaty that you end up with the division between the light and the heavy cruiser, at which point, you know, you can split out the Omahas from the Pensacolas or the Northamptons, etc. But unless you want to go through the process of wholesale changing everybody's hull numbers, you might as well just keep going from where you already were. Whereas with the large cruisers, aka the Alaskas, again, their mission profile is entirely different. The light and heavy cruisers fundamentally are designed for the same thing, to escort the fleet at high speed. Whether they're going to be trying to overwhelm their enemy with rapid-fire 6-inch guns, or they're going to be hitting the enemy at longer range with heavier 8-inch guns, their general targets, once the sort of slight wobble that was the Omaha's original mission profile has been dealt with, are pretty much the same. The mission profiles are the same, but the Alaska class's mission profile is to ideally hunt down and destroy enemy cruisers, which was never a top-ranking mission profile of the light and the heavy cruisers. They could do it, obviously. They were supposed to be able to take on their opposite numbers in a fight and win, but the Alaskas were supposed to explicitly hunt down cruisers and potentially multiple cruisers and win. So again, it's a big change in mission profile, which merits its own number sequence. Rob Smith asks, given all major shipbuilding countries were working hard to develop better armour, how long would it take the rest to figure out what one country was doing if said country's scientists had come up with an armour that was, say, twice as good but half the weight as compared to steel armour? And what would such a material do to the size of ship in terms of beam and length during the interwar years? In the interwar period, that would have been an interesting one, because essentially when it comes to armour development and how quickly everyone catches up with it, in the very early years of armour, the knowledge is, if not quite public domain, it's incredibly widely spread because it's mostly made by private manufacturers, and even then when it's made by navies in the 1860s, 1870s, people love to just trumpet it to the world. But as you go from there to the final developments in the run-up to World War II, and then theoretically in World War II as well, I guess, things became progressively more and more secretive, really kicking off around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So information became much more restricted. At first, it was just a case of, well, we just won't say all that much, and then it became actually full-on classified. So by the time you get to the interwar years, everybody is guarding their armour manufacturing secrets pretty thoroughly. And that's why you see the divergence in armour by the time you get to World War II. Because, I mean, while there are national characteristics to a certain degree in terms of armour manufacture in 1890, 1900 and World War I, by the time you travel through the interwar period to get to World War II, you've got countries with entirely different ideas of how thick the hard face of face-hardened armour should be. You've got countries with completely different ideas about how you should introduce trace elements and which trace elements and in what amounts and what your baseline steel should be, etc., etc. So if somebody in, let's say, 1928 comes up with an armour that is twice as strong but half the weight as steel, i.e. for the same weight it's 4 times the protection, I don't think, unless it's something that is spectacularly obvious in hindsight, and just telling people that it's possible might trigger some other bright spark in another country to go, oh yeah, that must be this. It's very unlikely that anyone else is going to catch on quickly, because I suspect what would happen, well, obviously it's going to be incredibly heavily protected as a national secret, but also you're probably going to end up with the Navy in question, I mean, if they've got any sense, probably manufacturing ships that look to be slightly lightly armoured in the overall sense, but are actually much more heavily protected in order to create a kind of, if you like, a disguise. So if we say 1928, so the biggest thing you can build is a heavy cruiser. Let's say that if people are building heavy cruisers with 4-inch armor belt, some people were, but that's a kind of an average. So if people are accepting, okay, 4 inches of belt armor is okay-ish for a heavy, well, what's going to be called a heavy cruiser, an 8-inch cruiser, then the Navy, who's got this magical armor, will probably go, okay, well, we are going to build a heavy cruiser or cruiser with 8-inch guns that has 3 inches of armor. Now, it's a little bit on the low end if you're going to include armor at all for a heavy cruiser, but people, if they're looking at your calculations, or your publicly stated calculations at least, will probably go, oh, well, maybe they've stuck in an extra gun. So, for example, let's say it's the Royal Navy and you've got the County class. The reason I use that is because they've got 4 twin turrets. So if the Royal Navy goes, okay, well, we're going to stick in this 3 inches of armor, which is it's the equivalent of 6 inches of armor in regular steel, but because it's only 3 inches thick, it weighs as much as 1.5 inches, whereas normally we'd be using 4 to 4.5 inches. And so we're going to put the difference in weight into another twin turret. So let's say now the Counties more kind of resemble a Miyoko type with 5 twin turrets and torpedo launchers, etc., but is coming in under the weight limit. People might have some suspicions about what else you might have done, but they're going to look at the specs and go, okay, not particularly brilliant belt armor, heavy firepower, speed. Okay, that kind of makes sense. That's probably fine. And then the British will just carry on with that, laughing about the fact they've got 10 guns, they've got torpedoes, they've got speed, and they've got what's actually the equivalent of 6 inches of belt armor. all under 10,000 tons, which is then going to confuse people like the Japanese, who are going to be going, we haven't quite managed a ship quite as good, and we violated the weight limit, but we can't admit it because otherwise we admit we're violating it. Now, of course, industrial and high-level espionage, national-scale espionage, may well discover what's going on. But I think if the nations in question, or the nation in question that had developed this magical armour, played their cards right, they could probably get away with it for a very long time. And even when people start to twig that maybe something's not quite right, it's still going to take them an awful long time to figure out what's going on, because this is not going to be publicly available info. Glenn Ricafrente asks, you described the capital ships of the South American Dreadnought race in a video, but how did the smaller such as cruisers, destroyers and submarines of the three countries compare? So the answer is, for the most part, they didn't, because they didn't exist. For example, none of the three navies got any submarines during the late 1900s, early 1910s period of the South American Dreadnought race. The closest you'll get is the Chileans getting some H-class submarines in the latter part of the 1910s, but that's well after the South American Dreadnought race is basically over. And the same with cruisers. If you look at the cruisers that are built for Chile, Argentina and Brazil, you'll see that when they were actually engaging in a miniature version of the arms race back when it was pre-dreadnoughts, they're ordering a variety of armoured and protected cruisers, but those ships start to tail off in the early to mid-1900s, and you don't see any built in that period until after the dreadnought race is over again, with one exception, and that's the Bahia-class cruisers, which are scout cruisers built for the Brazilian Navy. And to be fair, as scout cruisers, they're pretty decent ships. They're armed with 10 4.7-inch guns, bunch of smaller guns, a couple of torpedoes, pretty darn quick for their time period, given that they're commissioned at the very end of the 1900s. But you can see them see one of them on screen at the moment. But you have to bear in mind that just because these ships seem to be very thin on the ground, that doesn't mean that the various navies weren't thinking, we might need some cruisers, some destroyers, some submarines, etc., to go with our dreadnoughts. All three navies were thinking of this, and in pretty much all cases, the plans were drawn up, orders were placed, etc. But a combination of cost overruns, changes to the various nations' economies, and ultimately also World War I breaking out meant that, at least as far as subs and cruisers went, almost nothing was completed, with, as I said, the exception of the two Bahia-class. In destroyers, though, everybody did get destroyers during the period of the dreadnought arms race for the South American countries, well, the three that were taking part. The Argentines got some German-derived destroyers. Obviously, the Germans at the time would have called them torpedo boats, just under 1,000 tons, 27 knots, 4 4-inch guns, 4 single torpedo tubes, relatively large ones, actually. The Brazilians got some pretty small, pretty much torpedo boats built by Yarrow in the UK, about between 500 and 600 tons, actually about as fast as the Catamarca class, the Argentine ones. The Brazilian ones were the Para class, which is hilarious because I know it's Brazil, therefore Portuguese, but obviously in Spanish, para means stop, which is a funny name to me for a destroyer. So they're about as fast as their larger Argentine relatives, obviously much less well armed, only a couple of 4-inch guns and a couple of lighter weight torpedo tubes. But there are more of them. The Argentines only get 2 of theirs, and the Brazilians do actually end up with 10 of them. And the Chileans coming in clutch right at the end, also like the Brazilians, ordering from the UK. And because they're ordering a little bit later than the other two, they get much bigger, much better ships. They get the Almirante Lynch class, which are also kind of midway in size, in the size range. There's 6 of them, and they are just over 1,400 tons. They're over 30 knots, and they are armed with a lot of guns. As they go through life, their armament changes, but they start off with the same number of torpedo tubes, although in twin tubes rather than single launchers as the Argentine ships. And they have 6 main guns, starting out at 6 4-inch guns. But before the end of the 1910s, they were rearmed to carry 4 guns, a pair of 4.7s and a pair of 4-inch. So, they're arguably, easily the better of them, of the 3 destroyer types, but that's partly just because they're so much larger, with the flip side, of course, being that being ordered a bit later on, as you might imagine, some of them were requisitioned by the Royal Navy. So, as I said, 6 were built, 2 of them got to Chile, the other 4 ended up serving with the Royal Navy through the First World War, 3 of them ended up getting sent to Chile eventually in the 1920s, but one of them ended up being sunk at the Battle of Jutland, and that was HMS Tipperary, so she proved to be eternally a long way from her originally planned home. King Brock asks, would it have been feasible or practical at any point to have an external armour belt that could be easily dropped into the sea to quickly lose a large amount of weight and counter flooding? And if not, why not? Feasible, yes. From a technical perspective, that would actually be relatively easy to do. Practical, not in the slightest. So, from a purely technical perspective, well, as you can see here with this bit of plate being added on, you have bolts which are then sunk through the structure of the ship to hold the armour on. In theory, it would be entirely possible to make a system whereby these bolts could be easily released. That could be anything from special modifications to the bolts that would allow you to detach them with a particularly nasty blow from a hammer of some sort, probably a hydraulic one or something. Potentially, if you were going to play things really, really funny, maybe some kind of iron hook method with cabling, and then when you release the tension on the cabling, the armour falls away. You could even have, if you want to go down the not quite scuttling but similar scuttling charge style route, you could even have little rings of high explosive pre-formed, which would go over the bolt heads on the inside of the ship. Not enough explosive power to blow out the hull, hopefully, but enough to shear the bolt, and people could presumably go down into the void spaces, assuming they're not flooding, and apply these little rings and then hook them up and go boom, right, off goes the plate. There's lots of ways, from the relatively simple to the fairly complex, and from the possibly slightly less dangerous to the extremely dangerous, where you could do this. Your main issue would be access to the area where the armour is bolted into the hull, which doesn't tend to be particularly easily accessible on any ship along its entire length. There may be areas where you can, but not along the whole length, especially because some of it's underwater. However, from a practical perspective, it is absolutely not a good idea in the slightest, because while, yes, losing the weight might, counter the flooding, counter the weight of the water that's coming in due to the flooding, in the short term, your much, much larger problem is going to be that any mechanism which weakens the attachment of the armour plate to the hull to the extent that it can be readily and easily released at sea, as opposed to having to be taken off by fairly major tooling in a dockyard, will mean that when that armour plate is hit, or potentially even just near missed by an enemy projectile, whether that be a shell, a bomb, whatever, there is a massively increased chance of that attachment mechanism failing just from that, or from a particularly violent storm, at which point you might well end up with you losing armour plates in situations where you really, really don't want to be losing armour plates, which A, gets expensive because these things are difficult to fabricate, and B, especially in battle, that could render you very vulnerable at just the wrong moment. What happens if the enemy, say, gets a couple of straddling salvos, which normally aren't too much of a problem unless a few splinters come aboard, but the shock of those salvos, if that manages to detach a bunch of your armour plates, and then the next salvo comes in, which actually hits on the armour belt. And in a situation where that belt was still all there, the belt may well have resisted that shell, but in this situation, maybe that armour plate has fallen off because of the shock of a nearby short the salvo previously, and now you've got shells coming straight into you. So definitely not a practical solution because of the possibility of being rendered vulnerable just when you really, really don't need to be vulnerable. Plus, to be perfectly honest, in most cases, if you're in a situation where you would need to jettison the armour belt to counter flooding, you're probably going to be wanting to jettison the armour in the region of the flooding, and by dint of the fact that you are flooding, almost all systems which you would use to detach the armour won't be accessible. If it's a physical thing where someone has to get up behind it and start knocking bolt heads off with some kind of equipment, it's flooded, you can't get there. And if it's some kind of remote system, it's probably been destroyed by the same thing that blew a hole in the armour. Manani Wanderer asks, fleets, flotillas and squadrons, what are the differences and how have they changed during the period the channel covers? Unfortunately, this is one of those naval questions that is almost as bad as how long is a piece of string, because there are so many definitions of fleet, flotilla and squadron in different navies, progressing through different time periods, and even then they're relatively fuzzy. So there are some very broad overarching definitions which you can use as a rule of thumb, but even if you do that, there will still be quite a few exceptions, even to some very broad rules. So from a very broad perspective, fleet can refer to usually one of two things, either as a generic term referring to all the warships belonging to a certain navy, so the fleet of the Royal Navy or the Dutch fleet, etc., etc., or it can refer to a distinct, significant body of large warships. Now, that may include smaller warships as well, but it's primarily centered on what we would today call the capital ships. And again, speaking very broadly, you would want something to contain a significant percentage of a given nation's current frontline firepower to be classified as a fleet. And there can be more than one fleet, or there might just be one major fleet, depending on the size of the navy and also its commitments. So, for example, in the run-up to World War I, say in 1900, the Royal Navy would have several fleets. But by World War I, you had the Grand Fleet, and pretty much everything else had been reduced below that status. And similarly, the US sometimes would have an Atlantic fleet and a Pacific fleet, sometimes would just have an Atlantic fleet, sometimes just a Pacific fleet, but both of them could be referred to collectively as the US fleet. Which then brings us on to the next one down, which would be a squadron. And a squadron traditionally is still a significant grouping of warships which should contain at least one capital ship or close to, but is not big enough to be rated as a fleet. And yes, it is literally that fuzzy a definition, because what exactly is too small to be a fleet, or what is too large to be a squadron? Who knows? It could be anything. So this is why I said about the Atlantic and Pacific fleets, because at times in the US Navy, so many ships were in one fleet or the other that the other side of the equation would just be a squadron. And similarly with the Royal Navy in the 19th century, you might have the Channel Fleet, the Atlantic Fleet, the Mediterranean Fleet, etc., but you might have the China Squadron. So there would be a capital ship of some sort out there, cruisers, later on some smaller craft as well, gunboats, etc. But it wasn't considered big enough to be the China Fleet, except for the times that it was, and so it would normally be the Squadron, West Indies Squadron as well, being another good example of there. But, unhelpfully, squadron was also used in some navies as a subdivision of a fleet. So you could have a squadron which is its own separate, if you like, mini fleet, but a squadron might also be a dedicated unit of roughly or entirely homogeneous ships within a fleet. So 5th Battle Squadron, the Queen Elizabeth class, at the Battle of Jutland, was a squadron within the Grand Fleet. And initially you had the Battle Cruiser Squadron, but once that became the Battle Cruiser Fleet, you now had multiple Battle Cruiser Squadrons within the Battle Cruiser Fleet. And then, of course, the Americans, because they do things their own way, they have squadrons across all shapes and sizes. So, within the Royal Navy, you'd have battleship and battle cruiser squadrons. You would also have cruiser squadrons, but if you got below that, you would end up with flotillas, which we'll come on to in a bit. Whereas the US Navy, would have battle squadrons, and then they would have cruiser squadrons and destroyer squadrons and submarine squadrons, and they just like the term squadron. And that's the way they did things, which of course also doesn't help because the US Navy also would do things like battle divisions, and a US battle division is more akin to a Royal Navy battle squadron at the time that they're both being used contemporaneously. Fun, isn't it? And then you have the flotilla, and the flotilla is, generally speaking, the smallest of these by tonnage, if not necessarily by number, because a flotilla is traditionally held to be a collection of warships, but relatively small warships. So in the Age of Sail, for example, frigates, unhelpfully, might be organised into squadrons or might be spoken of as being in flotillas, but something like brigs would definitely be spoken of as being in flotillas, unless somebody decided to provide them as squadrons or divisions, because a lot of these terms were interchangeable a lot of the time. But when you get into the 20th century, you tend to find a lot of navies using torpedo boats, destroyers, submarines, and other small craft as they come and go as flotillas, although, as we mentioned, unless you're the US Navy, in which case everything's a squadron. But again, using the Royal Navy as a kind of benchmark, you would have destroyer flotillas, but destroyer flotillas are not, strictly speaking, a fixed amount of destroyers, although very often it would be somewhere between a dozen and 16. But a destroyer flotilla, at least in the Royal Navy, was usually a collection of destroyers which were all of the same class, or at least very similar performance specifications. And they would very often order destroyers by the flotilla. So, if you're looking at the interwar period, the A-class destroyers would all go into one flotilla, the B-class would all go into one flotilla, and so on and so forth. And this kind of bureaucratic division was very helpful right up until war started, and you started to lose destroyers here and there, and you had to amalgamate various flotillas into other flotillas, which then meant you had a bunch of destroyers of slightly different characteristics, and so on and so forth. Marlin Stout asks, "You've often spoken about how the armour on warships was usually designed to resist guns of the same calibre that the ship mounted, so a battleship with 12-inch guns would be armoured to resist 12-inch shells. Was there ever a ship designed to resist shells of larger calibre than that of its own guns, for example a 12-inch ship being armoured against 14-inch guns? And would this be a viable option for a navy that can't build guns above a given size if they suspect that their enemies might be building ships with bigger guns than they themselves can make?" Now, granted, in the treaty era, size and weight restrictions would make this impractical, but in the absence of outside restrictions, would it be practical to build such a ship? Yes, indeed, such ships did exist, and surprisingly, whilst they're not the majority, they are more common than you might think. And that's because the general rule of thumb of a battleship being armoured to resist its own guns came from the majority of the steel battleship era, which usually had everybody with some variant of the same caliber gun or close to it on their battleships. So if you armoured your ship against your own firepower, that was a reasonable bet that you were also armoured against most everybody else's. So, for example, once everybody had settled down in the pre-dreadnought arms race, the vast majority of pre-dreadnoughts were armed with 12-inch guns. And, occasionally there'd be one with an 11-inch gun or a 13-inch gun. But roughly speaking, if you armed your dreadnought with 12-inch guns and you said, okay, well, at my expected battle ranges, I think this armour will deflect 12-inch shells, or stop them outright, then it was probably well enough protected. Now, of course, this does bring in the other factor of what range are you expecting the battle to take place at? Because if you're expecting the battle to take place at much closer range, then to protect yourself against your own guns, you need much thicker armour, whereas if you think the battle is going to take place at longer range, either just because you have a more generous faith in the long-range firepower of the day, or you have done something else like make your ship faster with saved weight, so you think you can dictate the range, well then at that point an incoming shell of that same caliber is going to strike with less force at longer range, so you need less armour to protect yourself. But with all that said and done, there's two very easy examples, amongst a few others, where this general rule of thumb was not followed. So German battle cruisers, especially the later ones, such as, let's say, the Der Flingers, because they are armed with 12-inch guns, but by the time they're building the Der Flingers, they know that the British are going out there with 13.5-inch guns, and I suppose you could do that as a corollary with the Kaisers and Koenigs. They know the British are going out there with 13.5 and even 15-inch guns at that stage, and their battleships are still armed with 12-inch guns. So they have to armour their ships to an extent to deal with at least 13.5-inch shells, even if not necessarily on most of them 15-inch shells, because that's the guns that they're facing. So just armouring the Der Flingers or the Kaisers or the Koenigs against 12-inch gunfire would actually put them at a significant disadvantage facing off against the British ships with the bigger guns, which in some ways was kind of one of the points of the British design idea, because it forced your enemy to react to you in terms of their ship design. However, another example is the ship or the ship class that's been gracing your screens throughout this question, the King George V class, because when the King George V class were being designed, the treaty limits, the Second London Naval Treaty, which it was designed under, obviously said you could only have 14-inch guns. That's what the King George V were built with. But they were keenly aware that there were ships with 15 and 16-inch guns out there already. Some of them even belonged to the Royal Navy. And it might be expected that the King George V would have to fight them. And they also knew there were one or two more recent ships under construction with 15-inch guns, the ones that had gotten in just before the treaty. And they might also have to fight them. And combined with the fact the Royal Navy was looking for battles to take place at what were, for World War II purposes, fairly close ranges, they knew that if you're going to have to get in close to a ship armed with 16-inch guns, whether or not your ship has 14-inch guns, in the case of the King George V, you're going to need fairly significant armour. And this is part of the reason why the King George V's are so heavily armoured compared to almost every other treaty ship, because the Royal Navy's looking around going, we need to get up close and personal with ships that might have significantly larger guns than we do. Nicholas Ressar asks, if Hood doesn't detonate, how does the rest of the battle with Bismarck play out? How much of a battering would it take to put Bismarck, and presumably Prince Eugen, down, and how much damage do the British ships receive in return? It's a question which has many potential answers. A lot of it depends, I think, on exactly what happens with the salvo that historically destroys Hood, if it doesn't actually do that. Because you could end up with a scenario where the shell either is a dud, or strikes just that little bit forward, or detonates just that little bit earlier, and causes flooding and damage to Hood's machinery spaces instead of setting off a magazine explosion, which was essentially the point of departure that I used in my video about what might happen to Hood if she doesn't blow up, at which point Hood's machinery is crippled, she is forced to massively reduce speed, she has to bear away from the fight and is going to drop out of the fight due to that drop in speed anyway, at which point it pretty much goes the way it historically did, just without Hood blowing herself up and, over 1,000 men losing their lives. But if that shell doesn't hit, and Hood continues on her merry way. That's, let's say, that particular shell went short or long, because bear in mind there were other shells in that salvo that did go slightly short or slightly long, so it's not out of the question to say that that could have happened. Then you've got a series of interesting quandaries, because one, if the 20-degree turn to port that they were about to undertake when Hood exploded is completed, well, now Hood is able to bring twice as many guns to bear, and Prince of Wales can bring her aft quad turret to bear. So suddenly there's a lot more guns shooting at the German ships, which could be a problem. Also, now everyone is concentrating on Bismarck as opposed to previously. And also, Prince of Wales, bear in mind, has hit Bismarck repeatedly at this point, and Bismarck has flooding forward, the flooding that would eventually leave the big oil slick, which led to her being rediscovered, which means that sooner or later Bismarck is going to have to reduce speed or face rather rapid and rather disturbing progressive flooding from her bow spreading aft. So those are things that are positive in the British favour, and Prince of Wales has already, as demonstrated by hitting Bismarck repeatedly, shown that her fire control systems are pretty good. Conversely, obviously, Prince of Wales is steadily losing guns at a faster rate than she's regaining them through various technical issues. Hood doesn't have the world's best fire control system at this point, but if she steadies down on her new course, and obviously she has more guns to fire, thus more data coming back to her fire control computers, there's a reasonable chance that eventually she'll dial in. So all of this is good for the British, with the exception of obviously Prince of Wales's guns gradually diminishing the number that are actually usable. Conversely, as per the straddle on Hood, the Germans have already established the range to Hood and could continue firing and potentially hit Hood and do other damage, even if it's not catastrophic, that might force Hood out of the battle. The only thing that really mitigates against that would be, one, Hood and Prince of Wales have just completed a course change, so the Bismarck's fire control is going to have to update its solution, which to account for this new course and heading. And of course, whilst modern fire control systems in World War II can do this, a new solution does have a potential to introduce an error that wasn't there previously, especially if the ships have, lost an indeterminate amount of speed in the turn and are now accelerating again. That has the potential to throw salvos off for a little bit. And, of course, you also have the fact that just because you've locked onto a target doesn't necessarily mean that every single salvo from then on is going to be a straddle. We actually see that in the immediate aftermath of Hood's destruction. Prince of Wales is, of course, straddled and hit repeatedly by the German ships, but when you look at the records, you find that not every salvo was a straddle. There were a few, and then some went over, then they were back on target, then some went short, then they were back on target again. So, whilst the Germans having already found the range is bad news for Hood, it's not necessarily going to be as bad as every single salvo after the one that doesn't happen potentially could make it happen again. That's not how that's going to go. And honestly, I think it's a matter of time at that point. The less time goes on before some other decisive moment is reached, the more it favours the Germans, because the Germans, at this point of departure in history, they have the upper hand. Both of their ships have the range, and Hood definitely doesn't, and Prince of Wales, whilst she does, is having issues with her guns. The more time goes on, the longer the British have to bring their greater number of gun barrels into play, the more time Hood has to get her own range dialed in, the more time Norfolk and Suffolk have, if it goes on for another 20 minutes, half hour, to come up and start pelting Bismarck with 8-inch gunfire, which, whilst it can't penetrate the belt armour, as Dorsetshire would show in her final stand, can still do a number on her ability to fight. And if the battle goes on even longer than that, especially if Bismarck is forced to slow down shortly thereafter, then they have the potential of maybe even getting torpedo attacks in as well. Plus, as the fight goes on, you're going to have Hood and Prince of Wales both concentrating on Bismarck, so the statistical chances of more vital hits fetching up on Bismarck increases, which means, unfortunately, there is no real one answer, because if you run that scenario, a dozen times, and you just don't have Hood explode with that salvo, even if Hood's not hit at all with that salvo, she might be hit and destroyed in the next one. She might be hit and crippled in the next one. She might not be hit and crippled in the next 5, and perhaps in one of those 5, one of the 2 British ships lands a hit that severely damages Bismarck's ability to get accurate data. You know, maybe follow-up salvos from Hood or Prince of Wales damage or destroy the primary range-finding station, and poor old gunnery officer Schneider, which then degrades Bismarck's ability to hit, and then she could be worn down and the cruisers come up, and that pretty much that's all she wrote. So it could run the full gamut of possibilities, and as I said, if you run that scenario, you're going to come up with very different answers pretty much every time. Joao Rita asks, I know gun barrels are changed every so many shots, but what about the gun breech? Was it part of the change or completely separate from the barrel? Generally speaking, the gun breech is completely separate. So for most large-scale guns, especially battleship guns, for the Dreadnought period at least, most of those guns can be relined by, well, ideally removing the inner lining and replacing with a new one that's got, you know, intact rifling. If you have to get very desperate, then you can bore it out completely and insert a new liner, but in either case, the breech is not affected. However, if you have a particularly complicated and large gun, then the process of boring out and reinserting an entire new liner, rather than just removing it via heating and cooling, that might actually be too expensive, and you would just replace the entire gun, which would obviously mean a new breech would come with it. But also in the case of wartime, very often, whilst a gun could be relined, the process of taking a gun off of a ship, taking it away to a factory, relining it, checking it, testing it, and then putting it back on could be too long for the uses that the ship was needed for in wartime. So during wartime refits, very often, even though you could reline that particular gun, they would just drop in a completely new gun, and then the ship would sail off with its new guns, and the old gun that was removed would be relined, the breech wouldn't be changed, and then that gun would be ready for the next ship that needed new guns, which is why if you look at the pair of 15-inch 42s outside the Imperial War Museum, for example, you'll notice they've served on a number of different ships. But where guns are much smaller, say the secondary or anti-aircraft batteries of larger ships, or the primary batteries of ships like destroyers, because the guns are comparatively so much lighter and less complex, when those guns need replacing, it's often far, far easier to just yank the gun off, stick a new one on. You know, that job can be done in less than a day if you're quick, and then the old gun can be taken off to be reworked at leisure. Which is why, for example, if you look at HMS Belfast and you look at her twin 4-inch mounts that are remaining, you'll notice that almost every single mount is from a different manufacturer and a different year combination. There are, you know, some guns that are from the same manufacturer but of different years, others that are of the same years but different manufacturers. I think, if I remember correctly, there's one pair that are actually an actual pair, and that just reflects the wear and tear on Belfast 4-inch guns. She's got them, but they're all over the place compared to what her original, you know, uniform installation would have been. So essentially, the breech is not technically part of the change for relining a barrel once the barrel is worn out, but very often the breech would be changed simply because the entire gun would be changed. Kevin Weber asks, in looking at photos of the Gatos and Balaos and their associated dates, it appears that after about a year of service, some of the initial Gatos were modified with a partial cage-like structure added to the aft end, which I can only think is there to protect it from mine cables and the like. However, assuming the dates of the photos are correct and only some of the Gatos and eventually some of the Balaos added it, and not all, was it an ad hoc field modification? Was it due to some kind of incident, a lesson adopted from the Royal Navy, or a just-in-case modification since some of the subs might now operate in relatively shallow Japanese home waters? Now, I'm not 100% sure exactly what you're referring to, so if I've got my guess completely wrong here, please do, drop me a message and I'll follow up with a follow-up answer, hopefully after you've pointed me to some specific photographs looking at the exact structure you're asking about. But I'm guessing that you're referring to this structure, which you can see, as the photo indicates, is on the stern of the USS Tullibee in 1943. This structure is a prop guard, or more accurately, two prop guards, and this is actually a feature that you will find on pretty much all submarines of the time, and it exists, as the name suggests, to protect the propellers, because on ships with a very fine stern, particularly small ships, the propeller shafts will extend a fair degree outside of the hull, and the propellers themselves, in terms of their the area that they sweep with their rotation, actually also extends out past the hull. Now, that's fine for propulsion, but it means that when you're coming into contact with something like, say, a wharf or a quay or a pier or a ship, submarine tender or something like that, there is a relatively high chance that as your hull swings up alongside, your propellers, which are sticking out considerably further, are going to go thunk, thunk, thunk and chew through either the side of the repair ship, which they're not going to be particularly fond of, or just chew up the concrete of the wharf or the pier, which is also obviously going to damage your propellers and potentially also your propeller shaft and engines, none of which is good. And so these cage-like structures are installed on the back of such vessels, and they essentially define the sweep of the propellers with a little bit extra for safety. So if you're swinging up against something, then this will hit the side of whatever it is you're pulling up against, and the props won't. Exactly where these prop guards are and how large they are depends on the ship. So you'll see them on destroyers, frigates, that kind of thing. And as I said, you'll see them on submarines. But if you look at, say, a German U-boat, the location and size of these prop guards is different to what it will be on a Gato, which will be different to what it is on a T-class, etc., etc. And whether or not they're visible also depends on how high out of the water the submarine is riding. So if you look at, you can see some launch photos of Gatos and Balaos, and you can see these things are already in place, but the vast majority of photos taken of them, the sub sitting a little bit lower in the water than is the case with the Tullibee here, which means that you'll only see the upper portion of the hull casing, and it will be underwater, so you don't notice it. But then a sub that's sitting a few feet higher in the water, you do notice it. So I think that's what you're looking at. But as I said, if not, please let me know and we'll have a look at what it is you are actually asking a question about. Dylan Bartlett asks, if you had to pick between the Type 96 25mm Japanese anti-aircraft gun or the German 3.7cm or 37mm SKC-30 anti-aircraft gun for use aboard a ship in World War II, which one would you pick and why? And without fully redesigning the weapon, could it have been improved? In that case, I'm absolutely taking the 25mm, because most of the 25mm problems can be fixed, or in some cases are actually external to the weapon itself. The 37mm is a much more fundamentally flawed weapon. So with the 25mm, tightening up the mountings, that's easily done. There were a range of fixes that were in place during the war that were introducing better firing pins, things like this. But fundamentally, if you tie the thing into an actual functioning fire control system as opposed to point with stick, you're going to get much better results out of it. The other big thing you'd want to change would be the magazines. So, as you can see here, this triple mounting has a series of magazines put in there, and they're not the easiest things to replace, and that really didn't help matters. So you could either adopt perhaps a slightly shorter magazine with an open top, so you could just feed more rounds in. You could have people standing and then feeding rounds in relatively quickly, kind of like the Bofors 40mm would eventually do. And the other alternative potentially would be to adapt that mechanism to perhaps allow you to belt feed ammunition in. Now, that would be a little bit of a larger change, but it could be done, bearing in mind that the pom-pom, which is a 40mm weapon, had belt-fed ammo at this point. And even if you don't do any of that, you could make some modifications just to use magazines which are slightly easier to slot in and out. Some kind of quick change magazine. Well, quicker than they historically were anyway. So there are ways to make the 25mm a passable weapon, which are plausible, whereas the 37mm, whilst you can tie it into a good fire control system, all that, at the end of the day, it is a single shot weapon, which massively impacts its rate of fire. Now, the Germans were looking at a way to make it not single shot and thus able to fire a bit more rapidly, but that's a far more complicated procedure. At least as far as my knowledge of relatively small caliber firearms goes, i.e. things that are fed by magazines rather than fed by shells being inserted into the breech. As far as I understand it, it's much easier to adapt a magazine-fed weapon to either take belt-fed ammunition or adapt the magazine to allow the feed of more ammunition than it is to change a single-shot weapon into a fully automatic weapon, for example. And so even if all other, my easily corrected manufacturing issues on both sides are worked out, and they're both connected up to a half-decent anti-aircraft fire control system, you're still looking with the 37mm of a fire rate that sounds roughly like this. Whereas even at the lower estimates for the 25mm, taking into account all the problems with having to swap out magazines, which, as I said, you could in theory fix, but even at the absolute lowest rate, if you do nothing with the magazine issues, you've still got a fire rate that sounds a bit more like that. Which means essentially 4 times as many shells in the air, 4 times as many chances to hit something. And if you can fix those issues with the magazine feed and get it up to its actual true potential, seems to me an awful lot of a better deal than Matt Blom asks, in a recent History Goer video on USS Chesapeake, Lance briefly explains a naval action when the ship was under command of Captain Samuel Barron. Apparently, Chesapeake engaged HMS Leopard, but somehow throughout the action neither rammers, powder nor matches were ready on Chesapeake, and the ship was only able to fire a single shot all action when a resourceful crewman grabbed hot coals from the galley, presumably using them instead of a slow match. Barron was court-martialed and suspended without pay or rank for 5 years. Was this simply a case of absolutely epic incompetence on Barron's part, or are there other factors that contributed to Chesapeake's poor performance that day? I think whether or not it comes down to incompetence on Barron's part largely depends on every person's evaluation of the situation that led up to it. So, essentially, what had happened was Chesapeake was on her way to the Mediterranean. She was stocked for an extremely long voyage, and since the US wasn't at war with anybody and in 1807, and Chesapeake was near the US coast, it was reasonable to expect that you wouldn't encounter any hostile vessels. Now, of course, she is still a ship of war, so you can make the argument that even if you have no real cause to expect to encounter hostile vessels, you should at least still have some readiness for it. But, that's one of these factors that each individual has to make their own mind about. Leopard then shows up to retrieve British deserters, and she is fully armed, guns out, ready to fire. And again, you could argue, well, at that point, if he sees a hostile warship or potentially hostile warship bearing down with all weapons ready, then perhaps Chesapeake should have been getting ready at that point. But again, at that point, the British Empire and the US were not at war, and the British were at war in 1807, bear in mind, with the majority of Europe. So the idea of a British warship sailing around with all its guns primed and ready for action may not necessarily seem to be a direct threat to Chesapeake herself, but more just a general statement about, there could be a French frigate or Spanish frigate or two floating around in the immediate vicinity, which they might need to deal with. Again, judgment call. Do you think that Barron at that point should have readied Chesapeake anyway, or was he making an informed decision that this is probably for some other reason? Because of course he has no reason to suspect at this stage that Leopard has any hostile intent for Chesapeake. It's only once Leopard and Chesapeake have exchanged notes that he knows even why Leopard was hauling her over, because a ship coming up nearby and saying, hey, look, I've got dispatch for you, between friendly ships and neutral ships, asking a ship that's heading one way to carry mail for the other ship, and obviously that being reciprocally done, wasn't entirely out of the question. And given that Leopard was patrolling in the Western Atlantic and Chesapeake was heading for European waters, again, you could, if you're in Barron's place, reasonably suppose that perhaps Leopard is going to ask you to deliver some mail. Now, once that note has been delivered and it's clear what Leopard actually wants, then you can make an argument that Chesapeake should have gotten to quarters and prepared herself. And indeed, they did try. But this is where the whole, not expecting any hostilities in the area they were in and preparing for a long voyage came back to bite them, because, some of the, depending on the reports and the sources you look at, some of the guns just flat out weren't ready. They weren't seated properly or whatever. Others say that the guns were lashed up against heavy weather because they weren't expecting action, so they were tied down. And if you're expecting heavy weather and you've got lots of supplies and stores all littering the gun deck, which we know definitely was a thing, then all the stuff that could get in the way or potentially get broken, so the gun rammers, the sponges, etc., well, taking those below where they won't cause a fuss, that makes sense. And not having large amounts of priming powder and stuff scattered around the deck, well, if you're the forge was set up on the gun deck, so not having large amounts of priming gunpowder out when there's an active forge going, actually a good idea. But then having to revert that, bring up all the relevant equipment, find the priming powder, get the matches, the slow matches, and other forms for firing the guns ready, getting enough of the stuff out of the way that your guns can actually be made ready, and so on and so forth. All of that takes a lot of time, and it seems that was time that they didn't necessarily have, and there was a bit of confusion as well because they were trying to do it on the quiet, because there was a concern that if after the exchange of words and letters, if they were seen to be rapidly clearing for action, the British could then say, well, hey, look, we were just sailing around expecting potentially to run into French ships, we delivered a note, and then all of a sudden the Americans went to general quarters. They were obviously intending to attack us, which would theoretically put the Americans in the wrong. Whereas if you do it stealthily and the British open fire and you immediately open fire afterwards, then you're not so much in the wrong, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a series of stages in this action where you could make a judgment that Barron was derelict in his duty and should have had the ship in some other state of readiness. But equally, at almost all of those stages, you can make an argument that it was perhaps reasonable, at least from a general perspective, for him not to be in that status. But then, of course, what is generally reasonable and what the letter of the law says a warship should be capable of are sometimes different things. Jaime asks, considering how at the Battle of the Denmark Strait Prince Eugen detected the British with its hydrophones before they came over the horizon, was there ever any research or attempts by surface warships to search for the enemy acoustically whilst concealing one's own position until ready to engage the enemy? Well, outside of the obvious submarine versus escort and escort versus submarine conundrum, in which both sides would use hydrophones, what we today might call passive sonar, to try and figure out where the enemy was quietly whilst they're concealed from the enemy's other senses so that they can then launch a surprise attack, which obviously definitely was a thing in World War II. when it comes to larger scale surface ships using hydrophones to deliberately and specifically listen for the enemy acoustically whilst hiding and then launching an attack, I'm not aware of any major research or attempts. So something that's equipped with hydrophones, like Prince Eugen, for example, or destroyers, perhaps, in a night action, they might be able to make use of it. If they know an enemy is out there somewhere, and it would then give them a rough bearing. But to be perfectly honest, for the most part, the nations that have advanced hydrophones to the degree where you could use it for that kind of purpose at anything other than a dead crawl, by the time it really becomes truly relevant, they also have radar. And in a night action, something like that, radar would be far more useful, to be honest. So I don't think there's any real sort of major push by big ships to use their hydrophones to try and sneak up on the enemy. But, you know, as I said, maybe in some smaller ship actions, destroyers, small cruisers, etc., they might have used that as a kind of early warning system, pretty much as Prince Eugen did herself, actually. Coneled asks, is there a Royal Navy equivalent of Hannibal, i.e. a guy who almost managed to get us, so we tell great stories about our glorious victory over them, so that we can remember it, but it was still a really, really close run thing? Maybe De Ruyter fills that gap? I mean, De Ruyter would come close, but then De Ruyter wasn't, you know, defeated and driven off the field or killed by the Royal Navy. That honour actually ended up happening in the Mediterranean in a completely different battle in a slightly different war. So, yes, since the Royal Navy never actually managed to completely defeat De Ruyter, I don't think he actually ticks the box. I think if I was going to nominate anyone for that position, albeit that the whole Anglo-Dutch War series doesn't really get talked about anywhere near as much as it should, at least in the English-speaking naval history circles, I would nominate a Dutchman for the position, but I would actually nominate Tromp, because Tromp has a lot more parallels to a kind of naval Hannibal. You know, he leads his forces to victory a number of times. There's a number of closely fought battles, and then towards the end, there's a couple of defeats, and you know, there's a few other things thrown in there as well that very closely parallel Hannibal's life. And then at the end, he dies in battle. There's kind of an ultimate English victory over Tromp, even if that particular battle, the one where they managed to kill him, is tactically a victory but strategically a loss. But yeah, I think if there's a more close parallel to being the Royal Navy's Hannibal, it probably would be Tromp. De Ruyter, as I said, by his near enough undefeated track record when in command, is actually a bit too good to fit that category. But as I said, the only flaw in that particular argument is that in the English-speaking world, the Anglo-Dutch wars aren't really spoken about all that much outside of very specific battles. Ash, the Lego guy, asks, how portable were floating dry docks? Were they merely coastal, or could they be transoceanic? And how much modification was needed to switch between transit and being able to float a damaged ship and then back into transit mode? The larger floating dry docks can pretty much go wherever you want them to go. The only sort of caveats and restrictions to that are that, one, floating dry docks are generally held to have the hydrodynamic capabilities of a brick, so they're not going anywhere fast, and they usually don't have anything in terms of their own propulsion system, so that you will have to tow them. Some floating dry docks, certainly these days, but occasionally back then, would have some vague attempt at rounding out the front, which would give them slightly better hydrodynamic properties for towing, so it wouldn't just be like towing a massive brick or a very, very slab-sided barge. But, surprisingly as it might sound, as long as the thing is well built, a floating dry dock is probably one of the easiest things to get going, albeit slowly, across the water, because The floating dry dock, of course, has to be able to support its own weight when it's loaded, but that means that when it's unloaded, if you pump out all the tanks, then it has the reserve buoyancy of, greater. It has reserve buoyancy that's greater than the sum total displacement of a battleship, plus the buoyancy on top of that it needs to be floating when it's got a battleship loaded on it. So as long as the hull remains unbreached, a floating dry dock is actually one of the hardest things to sink in terms of overcoming its buoyancy. Now, obviously, it's not armoured or massively subdivided like a warship is, so if you start bombing it, that's another matter. But it just in terms of transit, you're incredibly unlikely to lose the thing, again, assuming it's been reasonably well built in the first place. And if you pump it out completely, or most way completely, you might want to keep some water in the base of it as ballast, it's obviously going to ride considerably higher, which means that it may not, even in at least relatively calm weather, it probably won't even be taking water along the main deck, if you like, the area where the battleship would, or other warship would normally sit. Now, there are pictures at various times of floating dry docks being towed through full-out storms, and they make it. So getting into transit mode, as I said, is basically just a case of pumping out as many ballast tanks as you feel you need to pump out and attaching some tugs or whatever, and off you go. And then putting a damaged ship in it, flood the ballast tanks enough to get the ship in, make sure you've put the dry dock blocks down, and you're back in business. The only real time you have floating dry docks having issues with transoceanic travel is if they've been built overly lightly in the first place, in which case they're very long structures, obviously, and sometimes you do have the odd floating dry dock that can break its back, but that's more usually down to poor loading choices rather than just the sea. Bajaki Hilmarson asks, the design and engineering of sails, what did different types do that affected other sails and so on and so forth? Now, to be fair, there's no way I can give a fully comprehensive answer in a few minutes, but at some point I'll probably end up doing a Wednesday video, looking for half an hour to an hour at sails and the different types and exactly how they act, which will be an interesting one, let's just say that. But this painting, drawing of HMS Victory under full sail, at least for the larger ships of the Age of Sail, does demonstrate the main types of sail that you would see. Now, because explaining exactly the meanings and the names and the relationships between the meanings and the names of the various sails, like topgallants, royals, studding sails, etc., that would take longer than we've got here as well. I'm just going to use very crude references to identify for you where each of the sails we're talking about are, and hopefully that'll be a nice little primer. So what you're seeing here is essentially four types of sail, four main types of sail. You have what you might call the main sails. There is actually a specific thing called a main sail, but the primary sails, the sails that you would most typically see deployed. And those are the sails that are on the middle and lower yard arms of the masts. So they're kind of front and center in this picture. They're big sails, often called square sails, although as you can see, they're not actually technically square, they're more rectangular, but never mind. And they face, directly into the wind. So they run perpendicular to the wind catches them, it pushes you forward. You get a much greater efficiency out of the larger sails, but equally, obviously, they're a lot heavier, a lot more difficult to manage, so you need more men to manage them. So these are your ship's primary propulsion. You then have the sails that are similar but smaller and slightly higher up. So these will be topgallants, royals, etc., depending on the nomenclature and how many there are, where they are, etc. These are basically working on the same principle, but they are slightly smaller. And when you will most often see these is either when the ship's under full sail, which is what's depicted here, or also when the ship's going into battle. Because when the ship is going into battle, obviously it needs a reasonable amount of propulsion. but you usually don't use the lowest sail because, well, as you can see, it kind of get in the way if anything happened to it. Rigging gets severed, it catches fire, it starts billowing everywhere. That could cause issues, apart from the fact it also limits the visibility of the men on deck. So usually in battle sail, that lowest level of sail will be furled, and to make up for it, you would want your upper sails, which are, as I said, still working on the same principle, just a little bit smaller. Those would be out. Now, between the foremast here and the bowsprit, you've got these triangular sails that are running fore to aft. These are triangular sails, sometimes called lateen sails. Technically speaking, a lateen sail would be mounted in a very specific way, but you get the idea what I'm talking about. The triangular fore to aft sails as opposed to the rectangular port to starboard sails. The advantage of a fore to aft sail rig, especially if it's, as I said, lateen mounted, which usually will involve its own yardarm, that allows you to catch the wind at a lot more angles. So with a square rig, sailing into the wind is very difficult. You usually have to run with the wind or at points off of the wind, but you can't really easily tack into the wind using purely a square-rigged vessel. The lateen sails will catch the wind and help drive the ship at considerably closer angles to the direction of the wind, but they are overall a little less efficient at catching the wind, period. So if you are in an area that has highly variable winds in lots of different directions, but you want to go in one specific direction, then a lateen sail means you will be able to head in that direction pretty much consistently, but you may not necessarily go particularly quickly in a lot of circumstances. Whereas a big square sail, if you're running with the wind, i.e. with the wind directly at your back or a point or two off to port or starboard, then you're going to get an awful lot of power out of that. And eventually what you see in the classic age of sail, like with Victory and a lot of other ships of the late 17th and into the 18th century, is a hybrid where they will have primarily square rig sails for power, and they'll have a number of fore to aft rigged triangular sails, including quite often a lateen rigged, properly lateen rigged triangular sail fore to aft on the mizzen mast, which will then allow them to manoeuvre much closer to the wind if they furl up their bigger sails. Sails up at the front, like these two little triangular ones, and also the bowsprit sail, which is not deployed here, but you can see the yardarm for it is present, and is very, very often present in multiple instances, i.e. there's more than one of them on the bow in earlier vessels. These are more often used for steadying the ship, i.e. keeping the ship's bow pointed in a specific direction, because of obviously the force that they're producing is the maximum distance possible away from the ship's center of rotation. So if there's force dragging the bow that way, the ship will tend to go in that direction, which is good because you don't want to end up broadside to the waves. And then the final bit of sail that we'll look at in this very quick crude analysis are these outer sails on either side. And these sails are not run very often because, as you can imagine, with all these sails out, you are involving a huge amount of manpower, and they are perhaps the most vulnerable of the sail. The yardarms out at this point are usually going to be slightly thinner, and of course the law of moments, the force exerted on the yardarms is going to be substantially greater this far out compared to closer to the masts. So whilst you can run at full sail like this, you wouldn't run with all this sail in particularly strong winds, because there's a very good chance of these outer sails blowing out or ripping up rigging, snapping yardarms, etc. But when you're in a circumstance where the wind is a little bit gentler, but you need the absolute maximum amount of force captured, then you run these kinds of sails, and then you can actually get up to surprisingly high speeds. You just have to be very careful about, the wind exceeding a certain rate, and that's when you have to bring them in again, which might actually drop your speed back slightly, even if the wind is getting stronger. And in very calm conditions, you would use this kind of setup to move, even if there's barely a whisper of wind. That's why in the famous painting of USS Constitution escaping a British squadron early in the War of 1812, where she's being towed by her boat, her rig looks pretty much like this does. But as I say, this covers essentially the age of sail only and is a very crude, quick analysis, so wait for the Wednesday video for the full naming conventions and exact methods of working and so on and so forth. HMS Inconceivable asks, in Armoured Carrier's archive of a radar gunnery training video, there are 3-digit numbers on the back of coats on the bridge crew of a Royal Navy cruiser at sea. Is there any significance to the numbers, or is it just to prevent people stealing each other's coats? I don't know for certain, and perhaps anyone who was in the Royal Navy at a time when this was practice, or maybe it still is practice, can chime in and let us know for definite, but I significantly suspect that this is just a way of inventorying the coats. So pretty much, he said, a way of preventing people stealing each other's coats, because these things will be issued, obviously, to individual sailors, but a coat is a coat is a coat, and very often being all-weather, this is obviously all-weather overcoat gear, this is not the kind of stuff you're going to stuff in your locker because it will make everything else damp and mouldy. So these would have to be hung up relatively communally to dry and to be easily accessible, at which point the last thing you want to do is have to rush out to your duty station or quickly pop in and pop back out if the weather changes and put on somebody else's coat, because A, then that person doesn't have their coat, and B, it may be the wrong size, which could be very inconvenient. And yes, you could sew name tags and stuff inside, but that means you're going to have to waste time, lifting up coats, looking for name tags, etc., etc. Whereas if you just have numbers on the back, then you can go, well, my coat is, in this case, on the left, 115. That's not 115, that's not 1. Oh, this one is 115, right, that's mine. And off you go. And the reason I'm suspecting that is, one, the numbers don't really correspond to any kind of numerical formal designation system in the Royal Navy, like service numbers and that sort of thing, but also the positioning of the numbers, because you'll notice 115 here on the left, his numeral is relatively high on the jacket, but definitely to the right of the spine, whereas number 200 and whatever, who's obscured here on the centre, whilst it's actually, in relatively speaking, a similar position, perhaps just a fraction lower, it's made to look a lot more different by the fact that two officers are very different in height, but you'll notice the number 2 indicates that this number is starting actually a fair bit on the left-hand side of the jacket and going across the spine. So this isn't a formalised, this is how they're coming out of the production line implementation. This is something that's been done at a later stage, possibly even on the ship, this particular vessel in question, to try and organise, how many coats do we have and which one belongs to who. Because the other thing, of course, is if one is lost, and you can say, well, my coat has been lost, or you lose your coat and try and take somebody else's, it's very easy to track down and go, oh no, you were issued this number coat, where is this number coat? And so you can work out who owes the Navy for a new coat, or potentially who just needs to be issued a new one if it was unavoidable. Grummancat asks, many of us are familiar with the Protection of Wrecks Act of 1973 and how it relates to the protection and security of wrecks and war graves in places like Scapa Flow or Jutland. With that law coming into effect 9 years before the fact, how was it that the Mary Rose could be raised and salvaged? Well, it comes down to the fact that the Protection of Wrecks Act 1973 and its subsequent modifications are actually one of the few relatively competently written laws in recent periods in the UK. So, Section 1, Part B, looking at the most recent revision of the Act, which was from 2013, but having looked through various previous revisions, I don't think the particular clauses I'm going to cite have changed much, if at all. Section 1, Part B says, in part, that the site ought to be protected from unauthorised interference. So not necessarily all interference, but unauthorised interference. And, of course, Part A specifies that a site either is or may prove to be the site of a vessel lying wrecked on the seabed. So the initial exploration work to find the Mary Rose wouldn't actually come under the Protection of Wrecks Act, because at that point nobody knew, or at least the Secretary of State didn't know or have reason to believe, that this was the site of any particular wreck of any particular importance. Once they discovered the Mary Rose, then technically it comes under the protection of the Protection of Wrecks Act. But then you get down to Section 5, which I'll read in pretty much full, and it says, Section 5, a license granted by the Secretary of State for the purposes of subsection 3 above shall be in writing, and Section 3 is basically tells you what you can't do by default to a wreck. Section A, the Secretary of State shall, in respect of a restricted area, grant licenses only to persons who appear to him either, 1, to be competent and properly equipped to carry out salvage operations in a manner appropriate to the historical, archaeological, or artistic importance of any wreck which may be lying in the area, and of any objects contained or formerly contained in the wreck, or 2, to have any other legitimate reason for doing so in the area, that which can only be done under the authority of a license. B, a license may be granted subject to conditions or restrictions, may be varied or revoked by the Secretary of State at any time, after giving not less than 1 week's notice to the licensee. And C, anything done contrary to any condition or restriction of a license shall be treated for the purposes of subsection 3 above as done otherwise than under the authority of the license. And instead, Section 3 is the bit that tells you what you can't do. Interestingly enough, Section 6 says that where a person is authorised by a licence of the Secretary of State granted to him under this section to carry out diving or salvage operations, it is an offence for any other person to obstruct him or cause or permit him to be obstructed in doing anything which is authorised by the licence, subject, however, to Section 3.3, which is another bit. So essentially, what that means, translating out of legalese, is that once a wreck is known, or an area wherein a wreck is contained is known, and it comes under the Protection of Wrecks Act, you aren't allowed to touch it or interfere with it in any way unless you have a licence granted to you by the Secretary of State in the UK. And if you do have that licence, then that licence may contain certain caveats which tell you what you can and can't do. But within that, the scope of that licence, assuming that you are competent, properly equipped, etc., and have a legitimate reason for doing so, and therefore been granted a licence, once you're undertaking that work, it now flips on its head and it becomes an offence for anyone to try and stop you from doing that. So what would have happened with the Mary Rose wreck would have been, the people who discovered it, the Mary Rose Trust, as they are now, potentially would have been at the time. I'm a little fuzzy at exactly the establishment date of it relative to the discovery of the wreck. But they would have gone to the Secretary of State and said, look, here's our plan. We want to salvage the wreck, record the artifacts, put them in a museum, etc., etc. And after negotiation, they would have been granted a license, and that would have then permitted them to salvage and preserve the artifacts and salvage and preserve the wreck, as you can see here. And Grumman also caveated that question with, please allow me to encourage you to hurry up with that Mary Rose special. Yes, that will come out at some point this year, subject to some further conversations with the Mary Rose Museum, because, come on, you can't really do a Mary Rose special without filming at that museum. Brian Smith asks, if there is no war with Japan, or even the threat of war with Japan, and the US only has to deal with a war against Germany and Italy, what do you think the US Navy would have looked like during World War II? I think a lot of this is going to depend on how far back this knowledge that there is no threat of war with Japan goes. No war with Japan, i.e. maybe, for whatever reason the Japanese back off enough to satisfy American demands in 1940 and 41, is a little bit easier, but quite why the US thinks there is no war with Japan, considering they spent most of the interwar period preparing for a war with Japan, is another question. But so if we interpret it, perhaps there's not a threat of war with Japan because, for again, whatever hand-wavy reason, Japan has backed off in 40 and 41 and done whatever it is they need to do to appease the US, and they're only having to deal with Germany and Italy. Surprisingly, a lot of the decisions that the US Navy makes might actually be fairly similar. There are only really a few things that are very obvious as changes. So if we start with battleships, building the North Carolina class, they're general purpose battleships. There's no real reason to change that. Building the South Dakota class, well, that's essentially the North Carolinas, but actually proof against their own armament. So again, pretty little reason to change that. Now, you might think maybe they won't do the Iowas because the Iowas are in part designed to deal with the Congos, and the Congos are very fast. Maybe they'll just keep going with 28 knot fast battleships. Actually, I think they probably still will build the Iowas, because whilst the reasoning will be slightly different, the outcome is probably going to be very similar. They're going to look over at Germany and Italy and look at the fact that both of them, when you look at things like the Hippas and the Zaras, etc., they have a track record of fairly obviously breaking the treaty limits. So with the Bismarcks and the Littorios under construction, or depending on the exact time of year, or the precise year, possibly even coming into service, the US is going to look at them and go, okay, these are treaty-breaking battleships. They are faster than the North Carolinas and South Dakotas. Therefore, we need our own faster capital ship that can hunt them down and kill them rather than just drive them off, at which point we're going to have to go above the treaty limits ourselves, and that's pretty much going to land you at 33 knots and 45,000 tons, which is what the design idea for the Iowas were in the first place. So the Iowas are still pretty much going to get constructed. The Montanas, ironically, of all things, are probably going to get cancelled faster, or maybe not even considered, purely on the basis that, with the best will in the world, even Italy and Germany's combined battleship fleet doesn't pose as much of a threat as the capital ship fleet of Japan. Because remember, the Italians have, at the very end of the modernization period, 4 modernized old ships, but only with 12.6-inch guns, 2 Littorios initially under construction, and yes, they're building Impero and Roma, so 6 to 8 ships. The Germans have Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the 2 Bismarcks, but again, the Bismarcks are only just coming out of construction, coming into service, and the Scharnhorst are fairly lightly armed. So whilst collectively the numbers add up to more than the Japanese, the force concentration that either can put together is less than the Japanese. So the Americans may just go, okay, well, we'll retain some modernized standards, but 15 or so, if you can bear in mind building Illinois and Kentucky, 15 fast battleships should be more than enough to deal with them. Cruisers, well, they're cruisers. They're always useful. Convoy escort, dealing with enemy cruisers, escorting your own forces. The Clevelands, the Baltimores, I think not really going to change all that much. The fact that they've got heavy anti-aircraft batteries, if anything, maybe even slightly more emphasized, because at least when you're fighting in the Pacific against Japan, for the most part, you have to worry about carrier strikes, which have certain limitations in terms of their payload and overall strike package size, whereas if you're thinking about a war with Germany or Italy, particularly Italy in the Mediterranean, you're potentially having to deal with considerably larger numbers of aircraft, including much bigger aircraft individually, which might carry significantly heavier weapons, so there may be an even greater emphasis on anti-aircraft firepower than you historically see in the US, which is an amusing thought, to say the least. Destroyers, a general all-purpose large destroyer that's relatively quick, that can take on other big destroyers with relatively large guns and has an ability to defend itself against anti-aircraft threats. Well, that's the Fletcher, and that's what you need to fight Italian and German destroyers, so not a lot of change there. That leaves us with, at least in the frontline warships, carriers and submarines. Now, carriers are an interesting one. If you're rigging your fleet specifically, or at least generally, to fight Germany and Italy, I actually don't think the US would reduce its carrier fleet that much, because if you're talking about naval operations, you're still talking about naval operations very far away. And yes, you might have the UK as an ally, which means Royal Navy and various bases all around. But at the end of the day, for your own missions, if you're doing stuff that you want to do rather than having to convince someone else that they should do it with you, those carriers are still going to be necessary. In fact, potentially even more necessary, because again, you're going to be going up against significant land-based air forces, i.e. again, potentially higher numbers, pretty much immediately. There's not going to be carrier battles in the middle of the Atlantic. So yeah, you're going to need a lot of flight decks. The design, however, might change somewhat. We know that the US did look at the potential for armoured flight deck carriers, And again, it comes down to this time period, because if they're thinking in terms of historically when the Essexes were ordered, so radar is beginning to come online, they've got some idea of its capabilities, they might still stick with the Essex design. But if this thought is going back a little bit further, maybe to the mid-1930s, when radar isn't operational, its capabilities aren't known, they might then come to a similar conclusion to the Royal Navy and say, well, actually, we might want a bit more survivability for the hangars of our carriers if we're going up against potentially persistent land-based attacks. So numbers I don't think will change, but possibly the design elements might change a bit. And then submarines are where I think the biggest change is going to be. The big fleet subs, the Gatos and the Balaos, will still have their place. They'll be very useful in the Atlantic. They'll have some use in the North Sea, etc. But as the Royal Navy found in the Mediterranean, particularly, and to a certain extent, off of the coast of France and in certain areas of the North Sea, in the English Channel, a big submarine is a little bit of a liability. And so whilst the Gatos and Balaos will continue to be constructed, they may have slightly fewer numbers constructed, and the US may then look at developing their own flavour of smaller submarines, something in the 700 to 1,000 ton range that is a little bit shorter range, but perhaps a little bit better suited for coastal and shallow water operations. Michael Gilson asks, was there any Marine Nationale warship of the interwar or World War II period associated with a red fish symbol? I don't know, is the straight answer. However, if any were associated with a red fish symbol, having gone through the names and associations and likely ship's badges of most of the Marine Nationale fleet, and let me tell you, that took a while, my candidates, if I was going to take a guess, would either be Dunkirk, as seen here, purely because the symbol of the city of Dunkirk includes a fish, albeit a blue fish with red fins. But when you look through the various ship's badges that various Marine Nationale vessels at the time seem to have come up with, it doesn't seem to have been quite as formal or as widespread as Royal Navy ship badges, for example. But they do seem to change the colours of some elements of their historical heraldry at times. And sometimes there are multiple badges that have been made for a particular ship, and some of them they'll be the same design but with slightly different colours. So it's conceivable that somebody took the fish symbol from the city of Dunkirk and turned it into a badge. The other likely candidate would be a submarine, but I wasn't able to find ship's badges for all the submarines or go through all their names. So, anyone who knows a little bit more about ship's badges in the interwar and World War II Marine Nationale and knows of a red fish symbol, feel free to chime in below and we can all learn a bit. Matt Osborne asks, what most likely caused the destruction of the Spanish battleship Jaime I, in your opinion? Smoking accident or smoking accident? Well, given the fact that the ship was in fairly poor condition previously, her crew was not the best disciplined at this point, and the ship was undergoing repair works, which is historically when most accidents of this type tend to happen one way or the other. It could be any number of causes. You could have old decaying ammunition, particularly obviously the propellant charges that just happened to choose that moment to cook off, or were disturbed in some way by someone who wasn't necessarily an expert in how to deal with them. You could have had a small fire or spark started by repair works near the magazines but not in them, which spread quickly enough to set the magazines off before anyone who was in the area who knew exactly what happened got away to say anything. But of course, if the ship's also open for repairs, that means lots of unfamiliar faces coming and going. So the idea of sabotage, which some suspected at the time, I mean, it's very difficult to prove if no one comes forward and claims responsibility, but it's possible. I mean, it was a civil war that was going on, so we didn't have to have foreign agents who could do this. You could just have someone from the other side who, as I said, would sneak in during a period when the ship was expecting to have lots of random, semi-unknown people wandering about the vessel. Or it could just be an accident, as I said, with the relatively ill-disciplined crew going around and someone just deciding to do something that turns out to be a little bit dumber than usual. So, honestly, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to call it either way. Because whilst most of the mysterious ship explodes whilst in port situations had come about in the 1900s and the 1910s, well, firstly, she is still a ship of that era, and secondly, whilst much less common, ships randomly exploding in port when you really don't want them to, like Mutsu, still did happen in this time period. DM Phoenix asks, I was reading an account of the sinking of RMS Lusitania and noted the case of the lifeboats being unable to be launched due to the severe listing of the ship. However, I wondered if it would be possible to simply load up a lifeboat with people, leave it untethered on deck, and then simply wait for the ship to sink around it as an alternative to lowering the boat off the side. Unfortunately, there would be a few problems with this. Firstly, the lifeboat davits, which hold the lifeboats, are not designed to position the boats on the ship's deck. They suspend the boats above the deck, but the davits kind of look like big metal question marks. And whilst I'm not an expert in davit design, I rather suspect the davits are not designed to be able to rotate a full 180 degrees and then allow you to lower the boat over and onto the deck. And even if you theoretically could, whether or not the davits are positioned in such a way that rotating them would allow them to clear the bow and stern of the boat is also a question which I suspect, looking at where they're mounted, that they may not be able to do that even if you wanted to. So if you're not able to lower the lifeboats over the edge because the ship's listing, then at best they're going to sit in the davits, and the davits are not strong enough to support the lifeboats. I think if you drop the lifeboat onto the lower part of the davit, they're hanging from ropes, and also they're a continuous curve, so it would be very unstable. So if you were going to retain the lifeboats aboard the ship, because it's, as you can see here, listing too badly, they would have to be still hanging in their davits, and as that list gets more and more, then eventually the boat's going to fetch up against the davit, which is going to tip it to a certain degree. And that means that you're going to have further problems, because obviously if you cut the ropes to the davits, then even if the davit does support the lifeboat very well may pitch over and spill its contents out either back onto the deck or back down the side of the ship, and thus be a bit useless to you. But also then once the ship goes down, you're going to have to very quickly release those ropes, and if you're talking about, as you can see with this picture, port side boats, i.e. they can't lower themselves down the side of the ship because the ship's at too much of an angle, then you've got the problem of if the ship rolls over onto its side, then there's still nowhere for the boat to go until the ship goes under completely. But if the ship continues rolling as it goes down, the boats may then be hit by a portion of the ship, which is going to smash them up and take them down with it. And then, of course, you've got the problem of suction, which we demonstrated in a previous video a couple of weeks ago. And so if you have a lifeboat that's literally right on the ship as it goes down, even if the ship sinks on a nice even keel in such a way that the lifeboat doesn't have all the previous problems we mentioned, the vessel going down may well just suck the lifeboat down with it. Or upwellings of bubbles and wreckage might smash the lifeboat, or any number of other things might happen. So, unfortunately, whilst there is a theoretical sort of, needle in a haystack circumstance where just sitting in a lifeboat waiting for the ship to sink around you might work, in most cases it's almost certainly not going to. Sergeant Schultz asks, when were gas ejection systems for large caliber breech loading guns realised as necessary, and what mechanisms were used? Well, a system for extracting the last remnants of the charge bags and blowing out the hot gases in the aftermath of firing a big battleship main gun, the need for such a system had been appreciated since pretty much they'd gone back to turrets. So essentially the start of the pre-dreadnought era. So prior to that, the rate of fire and also the burning temperature and charge type used in your traditional biscuit tin style turret guns had been such that, with a little bit of clever invention in terms of the gun shaping and so forth, you would have appreciated air injector systems or gas ejector systems, but they weren't necessary, and they certainly, for a lot of them, weren't actually installed. Mostly because the systems didn't exist. Then you had the period of open barbette guns in the late 1880s and early 1890s, and of course, at that point, it's much less of a problem because you're in the open air, so stuff can just dissipate into the air. But then once you get into the mid-1890s and you get the sort of proper pre-dreadnoughts with enclosed gun houses again, and you've now got the new improved higher energy propellants, now you have something of a problem. And it seems, looking at the various engineering literature of the time, that this is pretty much when the first full-scale gas ejection or air injection systems for battleship guns start to come about. And then in various navies, depending on the drive, the circumstance, and the rate of technological adoption, they start to be installed from the very end of the 1890s through into the early 1900s. So, for example, in the US Navy, they're beginning to be installed in the 1900s. But then in 1904, you have a particular incident where on the USS Missouri there was an explosion, and that mandated, as a result of that, they mandated that air gas ejectors have to be installed on all guns above a certain size from that point forward, including retrofitting older ships. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, during the Second World War, the US Navy deployed several squadrons of independent non-rigid airships, aka blimps. Were they unique in this type of deployment, and if not, who else deployed blimps during that war? Using blimps as anti-submarine warfare platforms is not, for convoys and stuff, is not technically a unique deployment. It is unique for World War II, however. So a large number of anti-submarine and convoy escort blimps were employed during World War I, which is where the US originally got the idea from. But come World War II, the vast majority of non-rigid airships used by the British, for example, were barrage balloons. So they weren't crewed. They were just the balloon bit used to try and persuade aircraft to not fly really, really low. So when you see images of the D-Day landings, of course, that's all barrage balloons. So the US deployment during the Second World War of mostly the K-class blimps was pretty much a unique thing. So nobody else seems to have deployed blimps in any great numbers or potentially even at all, mostly because really the only people who would have a use for them would be the US and the British, because the Germans, to fly blimps out on anti-sub patrol, would involve coming across coastal command and fighter command aircraft, which the lifespan's not going to be particularly long at that point. The Italians, not quite as bad a boat, but the Royal Navy would, carrier aircraft and such would definitely have pickings over them, and the Italians just don't seem to have used them much at all. The Japanese, in theory, could have, but they don't seem to have. Possibly because it took them a while just to get it through their heads the idea of anti-submarine escorted convoys, and obviously they didn't do very large convoys either. Whereas the size of Allied convoys makes blimps economical to use. And then, of course, as I said, the British, but they don't seem to have used the blimps, potentially because if you're operating blimps from the British coast, whilst you're not going to be using them over the North Sea, you might use them over the western approaches and so forth, you still do have the problem of things like condors, which could relatively easily down a blimp, whereas over the western and central Atlantic, there's really no threat to them. Gregory Albert asks, realistically, could two Wickes-class destroyers really take out an Amagi-class battlecruiser? Well, that's the Destroyerman series, I think. Now, is it plausible for Wickes-class to take out an Amagi? Yes. If, from what I've heard, the method precisely that's discussed, with ramming and close-range fire into the steering, I mean, in a 1 in a million situation. Yes, kind of. I think the kind of shades of Laffy and company versus Hiei at Guadalcanal there, but far more prosaically, to be honest, normally if a destroyer or destroyers get that close to something like an Amagi-class battlecruiser, someone somewhere has done something terrifically stupid, because an Amagi should be able to rip a pair of Wickes apart at considerably longer range than that with its secondaries and main batteries if there's nothing else worth engaging. However, in a period when all the Wickes-class are actually out and about on the front lines and a theoretical Amagi-class is actually complete, this is probably going to be a period before radar, at which point a night action, you could potentially pull that off. So if the, let's say, visibility is a bit lower, maybe there's a sea mist or a fog, which is obviously then limiting how far anyone can actually spot incoming vessels, and you've got a couple of Wickes-class going along, and they've got intel that, say, an Amagi-class is going to be passing this particular area. Maybe there's some kind of geographical constraint. I think minefields were in the Destroyerman series, but it could be islands, a passage, whatever. So they're lying there, boilers primed, waiting, listening, perhaps even, referencing an earlier question, perhaps even using some kind of hydrophone gear to listen out for incoming machinery noises. And then once they reckon they're within range, picking up the speed, making the interception at relatively speaking close range, which minimizes the advantages of the Amagi's guns and whether or not the Amagi's going to know they're there in the first place. And then given the number of torpedoes on a Wickes-class, I would just, fire off a full barrage from one side of my ships and then come about and launch another barrage from a different angle and hope that the Amagi's reaction time isn't particularly brilliant, because at that point, you could quite easily down an Amagi with 2 Wickes-class in that specific kind of engagement scenario. I mean, heck, at that point, if you're ahead of them, you could just run in a staggered pair down either side of the Amagi at maybe a 1,500, 2,000 yards range. Obviously, you could use your guns, but it's not really going to do all that much, to be honest. But again, you could just, unleash two full sets of torpedoes, one from each destroyer. You've pincered the Amagi between the torpedoes by staggering your ships. Hopefully, you've staggered them in a way that misses won't then hit your own vessels. The first wave will probably inflict sinking damage, almost certainly crippling damage, and if it is crippling damage, well, you can loop back round and just do a 180 and fire your other torpedoes, and then it's definitely sunk. So it's possible, but requires specific circumstances and a lot of luck. Andre de Coult asks, what were the benefits and drawbacks of splitting the Pacific Theatre into Admiral Nimitz's fief and General MacArthur's fief? There were 2 main benefits to this. Firstly, was political. It meant the army could play with having its own Pacific area to run around in without having to feel subordinated to the Navy for an entire geographic campaign zone, i.e. the entire Pacific region. And more specifically, it meant that you had somewhere to put MacArthur where he would stop whining about being subordinate to somebody, or worse, if you put MacArthur in charge generally, I dread to think what he would have done to the US Navy if he'd had command of the entire Pacific region. So essentially it was a way of hiving off MacArthur and by extension the army into their own little patch zone where they could play around and not cause massive amounts of disruption, which would obviously be deleterious to the overall war effort. There was the other advantage, which was a little bit more practical than political, which was that, as you can see, the Southwest Pacific area contains as well as Australia, the bulk of what is now Indonesia. At the time was the Dutch East Indies. And as you can tell, compared to the South Pacific area and the Central the Pacific area, there's not a huge amount outside of Japan itself in the Central and South Pacific areas in terms of land masses, and those land masses are relatively small, which means that a naval-led operation with naval landings by Marines and also Army units, but an amphibious force that can be supported from the sea, that is very much the purview of the Central and Southern Pacific areas, and to be honest, even the North Pacific area, whereas the Southwest Pacific area, with those bigger islands in there, obviously that is a bit more of a conventional land-based campaign, so it does make sense that the area most likely to involve extensive land-based campaigns away from the coast should be predominantly looked after by the Army, whilst the area where it's almost impossible to escape the range of a battleship's guns should be predominantly looked after by the Navy. But of course you needed Army troops over in the Navy-dominated areas to help out with the landings, and you needed Navy ships in the Army-dominated area to maintain security and fight your way forward, because you'll notice, for example, that the Philippines are in what's technically speaking MacArthur's area. The drawbacks, to be perfectly honest, mostly centered around MacArthur and his rather bizarre ideas of how to conduct grand strategic warfare. If you'd had a slightly, I wouldn't necessarily say sane, but slightly more rational general in charge of the army, then the division of command probably would have worked a lot better. You know, that's not to say it didn't work okay. You know, the US won the war, and there's only a limited number of circumstances where you can point to the division and say, look, this actually cost us a lot more than it should have. But there were better generals in the US Army than MacArthur who could have improved the situation somewhat and led to better cooperation. Nathapron Hongsharon asks, why did the Japanese change their heavy cruiser guns from 200mm to 203mm and go up to 155mm when they already had 152mm guns? Given that barrel boring and rifling was and still is the hardest part of gun manufacturing, changing the tooling like that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, I can't hand on heart swear this is 100% accurate, but I have read a number of sources that indicate that possibly the motivation was simply getting the maximum bang for the buck, because if you look at the naval treaties, because obviously some nations were using round numbers in metric, i.e. 200mm and 155mm, and some nations were using inches, which would be equivalent of 203mm and 152mm, 8 inches and 6 inches. The Japanese just looked at the treaties and went, what is the single largest caliber gun we can have? We'll have that. Because when you look at when the 203mm, which is true 8-inch, comes in versus the 200mm, which is technically 7.9-inch, both in terms of new ships that are built with it and ships that are refitted with it, and the same with the 155 versus the 152, it all seems to pivot around the introduction of the naval treaties. So given the Japanese desire for absolute maximum quality, given that they were limited in quantity, I think there's probably a decent amount of mileage in suggesting that the Japanese just, were taking the maximum caliber of gun they were allowed, even if it was by a couple of mil, in the treaties, and going, this is what we're going with from now on. The Judge 2017 asks, did the Royal Navy and Fleet Air Arm ever attack mainland Germany in air raids like the US Navy attacked Japan? No, and for the simple reason that, apart from things like risking carriers with lots of U-boats and mines and E-boats potentially in range, the simple strategic situation was a lot different. Britain as a whole, and England in particular, was not exactly far from Germany. So if you needed to hit Germany with lots and lots of bombs, that's what Bomber Command was for. Now, eventually, obviously, the US would occupy islands that were close enough to Japan to launch B-29 raids from. But you could say, well, maybe you need to do precision strikes at low level, which is obviously what US Navy torpedo bombers and so forth would be relatively good at. But again, because Britain is close enough to Germany that twin-engined aircraft like Beaufighters and Mosquitoes can pop over to Germany relatively easily, then if you wanted to launch a low-level precision strike, then you would use Coastal Command Beaufighters. If you wanted to go in for torpedo runs, RAF Mosquitoes. If you wanted to go in for bombing runs, and obviously there's a lot of them, and you're not risking a precious carrier hull, so it's just easier to use those land-based assets rather than go in with a fleet air-arm carrier strike, which ultimately, compared to Beauforts, Beaufighters, Mosquitoes, Typhoons even, or the big heavy bombers, etc., they carry less, and there are potentially a lot fewer of them at more risk compared to just using better assets. Whereas for the US, even when they had bases they could operate B-29s from, they aren't really able to send in substantial numbers of twin-engined strike craft from those bases to reach the targets in Japan that they want, at which point the attack power of carriers becomes a lot more attractive. Eric Van Dooting asks, how do you think the Second London Naval Treaty would have differed from reality if Japan had had a similar willingness to negotiate compromises and sign it as they had for Washington and First London? Would the definition of an overage capital ship still have increased to 26 years with a signatory that was both eager to resume building and more of a potential enemy? I mean, it would have required some fairly massive internal changes to the Japanese political system as it existed in the mid-1930s, at which point what exactly would replace that could be anybody's guess. So, as a result, what the treaty looked like could be anybody's guess. But if we assume the minimum necessary divergence to get Japan from its position of stuff the treaties building the Yamatos and the Shokakus, etc., down to, okay, we might actually be able to abide by something of a treaty, so they're still going to be fairly aggressive in pushing things, that kind of treaty probably wouldn't look hugely different from the First London Naval Treaty, because, as you said, Japan really wants to get in on replacing ships. Given that they're the smallest of the big three navies, modern ships with their qualitative and technological advantage make the most difference to them, so they almost certainly would have insisted that at least some capital ship replacement could go ahead. And maybe they would have said, okay, well, we want to keep the replacement options open for any ship that has superannuated at the point that we are signing the treaty or at the time the treaty comes into effect, and maybe we'll agree to an extension for ships that post-date that, which would have been a rather clever one, I think, because if they argued maybe to age the ships from when they were laid down, that would allow them to replace the Kongos, the Fusos, and the Isseis, whilst essentially at that point the only old ships that they would have in their inventory that would therefore not be replaced immediately would be the Nagatos, and given that the Nagatos are the 16-inch armed ships of their fleet, they could then be modernised and overhauled to last considerably longer. The Royal Navy probably wouldn't have minded too much either, because that would give them the impetus to preserve Hood and obviously Nelson and Rodney, which would also then fall into this extended superannuation, but everything before them, the R-class, the Renowned Repulse, and even the QEs, because obviously they're modernising some of those QEs, would all be potentially up for replacement relatively swiftly, but they've got a choice between modernisation and replacement, obviously the R's being the first to go. And for Japan's purposes, it actually hits the US the worst. Because whilst the US did want to modernise the so-called Big Five, the 3 Colorados and the 2 Tennessees, this would force them to keep the Colorados and the Tennessees around. So that clause, for the Japanese, it forces them to keep 2 ships. For the British, it forces them to keep 3 ships. For the Americans, it forces them to keep 5 older ships, which means that if everybody is sticking to the displacement limits, etc., then that means that proportionally Japan is going to have a more modern battleship fleet than the US, and even its older modernized ships will be 16-inch ships, whereas 2 of the US modernized ships will be 14-inch ships. And keeping that in mind, the Japanese will probably not agree to the gun caliber being reduced, because that particular sort of fix with the superannuation of ships, plus keeping the gun caliber at 16-inch, does give them a marginal leg up over the US fleet compared to what they would have had before. They might agree to the light cruisers going down to 8,000 tons, because they might calculate that, well, with the Megamis being able to be converted into heavy cruisers, that's going to give them a secret advantage in heavy cruisers should any war break out. And subsequent light cruiser design, the Aganos and the Oyodos, whether or not it's 8,000 tons isn't going to make much odds to the Japanese at that point. I also think they would have pushed for larger aircraft carriers to be retained, partly because of their evolving aircraft carrier doctrine, and partly because, of course, the larger the displacement that you can have for your aircraft carriers, the more scope there is to cheat and get an even better vessel. Because if, let's say, they accepted the 23,000 ton limit that was historically put in or agreed to at Second London, well, you can maybe get away without being too obvious with 25,000 tons. So that's an extra 2,000 tons, which might give you some additional capabilities, but not a huge amount. Whereas if you go for 27,000 tons, you go, well, maybe we want to go back to what the Washington Treaty said the limitation was. Well, 27,000 tons, well, apart from already being another 4,000 tons worth of ship, you could probably stick another 3, maybe 3,500 tons and get a 31,500 ton carrier on, which obviously an extra 3,500 tons of capability is significantly more than 2,000 tons of capability. Again, without putting up too many flags. The various powers might still go, I'm not sure about this, but there is a bit more headroom in there. Farragut, Farragut's Froggagut, Forger Foraging for 4 Forgotten Frogguts for 4 Froggut Friar Fair, asks, why did the Royal Navy actually effectively discontinue the name Victoria after the pre-dreadnought? Considering her effect on the Royal Navy and the double meaning of the name, I would expect it to be more popular in the period before the Canadians finally chose it for their submarine name in the 1980s. Basically because the use of the name Victoria specifically was following the Royal Navy tradition of naming a ship after the sovereign. It's just that Victoria was around for so long and technology changed so radically, she actually ended up having more than one ship named after her. But given that by the time Victoria, as pictured here, was sunk by accident, you had gone through Victoria's reign for quite a while. The PR value of having Victoria sunk the way that she was kind of would have put them off using the name again for a little bit as well. And so, having sort of done their duty, we've named a few ships after the sovereign. We don't want to keep doing so. The name, as you said, would pretty much discontinue. Pretty much only really came about in Victoria's reign, for that matter. The King George V, as I've explained before, was a little caused essentially by the succession and abdication crisis in the 1930s. Otherwise, we would have only had one King George V. But variants of the name were then reintroduced into Royal Navy service because, of course, Victory, which would be the obvious one, had kind of stopped because we still had Victory around, still do. With Victoria now kind of kicked into the long grass, they then brought back yet another variation, Victorious, which was then one of the Majestic class pre-dreadnoughts at the end of the 19th century, and of course one of the illustrious class carriers in World War II, and now is a nuclear missile ballistic missile submarine. John McDonough asks, in the footage of the attack on the USS Enterprise at the Battle of Santa Cruz, a bomb hits up forward on the ship, and this starts a SBD Dauntless bouncing across the deck until it ends up in the starboard aft 5-inch battery. What else was bouncing on the ship? How long do the shock effects last? Does it reverberate around the ship for several minutes, or is it a one-and-done deal? Could the shock affect the oil and or aviation gasoline in the tanks? Depending on the location of an explosion and how large it is, such an impact can reverberate through a ship for several seconds, but not much longer than that. And as I said, it depends. If you take a hit to the superstructure, most elsewhere on the ship's not really going to notice all that much. If you take a a torpedo hit to amidships or a really heavy shell hit to the belt armor. If you're a battleship, then that can go on somewhat longer. You've also got to consider even things like resonance, because flipping back to World War One, when Seydlitz gets hit by a 15-inch shell, that whips her stern back and forth so hard it snaps the radio wires that are running between her masts. That's a huge amount of movement, and with the best will in the world, no 15-inch shell contains enough kinetic energy to cause a 20+ thousand ton battle cruiser to go whipping back and forth, unless there's some other factor involved, like, say, the fact that the impact, the detonation, the location, or a combination of all three set up some kind of resonance in the ship. But to answer the latter part of your question, yes, the shock can affect the oil and or aviation gasoline in the tanks. It jumping around, the tanks getting cracked by passing shock waves, leaks and so on and so forth were a major concern. And that's one of the reasons why, especially the aviation gasoline tanks, which are the more volatile of the two, were usually massively heavily protected, both directly and cushion against shock, in good carrier designs. And obviously you have the peculiarity of a gasoline tank that's half empty or 2/3 empty actually being more dangerous than one that is full, because one that is full worst might crack and leak, which is obviously not great, but you can deal with that. Whereas one that is partially full, the initial shockwave might cause a significant portion of what's there to aerosolize or vaporize, depending on how intense the shockwave is, at which point, when the tank cracks, you now have a ready-made fuel air bomb rather than one that's just in the making. But when it comes to the SBD, which I believe is what's pictured here, you're looking at a number of factors. I think partially is the fact that, yes, the shockwave initially would have given it some bounce. Then you've got the fact that, being a carrier aircraft, there are shock absorbers in its landing gear, which means that if it comes down very heavily, it's going to keep bouncing. And then you have the fact, as you can see here, Enterprise is both moving forward and tilting, which is going to provide some additional energy, because obviously when it's above the ship, when it's in mid-bounce, it's then going to come down on a ship that has a different relative motion to it, but very slightly, plus of course the slope. And again, it's very possible, because obviously the entire complement of aircraft aboard didn't all start hopping their way off the side of the ship, that again you just have a slight confluence of resonances going on, whether it's the resonance of the shockwave passing through that particular part of the flight deck that initially perhaps gave more energy to the SBD, or just something about that particular SBD setup that meant when the shockwave passed through it just happened to hit a sweet spot. The thing is, whilst resonance does occur on a macro scale with obviously things like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, when you look into the finer engineering of warships and other very complex large structures, you can find that resonance can occur in multiple different locations at different times due to a single cause, but that same cause may not cause any resonance in other portions of the ship. And so you can have very localized, very destructive effects, but 20 feet away, everything is absolutely fine. And, this is part of what makes things so unpredictable when warships get hit, because you can, to a certain extent, obviously with highly complex computer simulations, model theoretical effects, but the vast majority of even modern damage control computations assume certain standards, if you like, certain levels of propagation and certain properties of materials and so forth, because to model absolutely everything about a ship down to the precise resonant frequencies of every single material that the ship's made up of, and how that they might interact with each other depending on how they're fixed together and what is on them in terms of furniture and crew and bombs and so forth, the movable loading, it's just so insanely complicated that not only would it take far, far longer for any kind of simulation to run, but the amount of man hours that go into making that program would be also ridiculous. And of course, it would also be somewhat too wholly wrong, depending on the situation, because what exactly all these various complex effects would be if you have, say, a carrier where its hangar is full of aircraft, compared to an aircraft carrier with its deck full of aircraft, compared to an aircraft carrier where it's flown off its aircraft, compared to a carrier that's, mostly loaded down with fuel and ammo to one that's almost exhausted its fuel and ammo. Each one of those cases will have things happen in very different ways. So it's easier, faster, and cheaper to just assume some basic standards. But those basic standard values will also mean that when something actually happens, you're going to get things that deviate somewhat from the predictions, which is why analysis of battle damage and SyncX's live ones are so valuable for navies to analyze. Chase Cogburn asks, during the bombardment of Iwo Jima, the battleships were somewhat ineffective due to the underground tunnels that the Japanese had. If the US Navy knew about this, would using armor-piercing shells have been more effective? Theoretically, yes and no. The biggest problem with AP shells is, although they do have a burster charge, it is relatively small compared to the amount of explosive that in US terms, an HC, a high-capacity shell, carries. Which means that general bombardment with AP shells isn't really going to do anywhere near as much damage. You'd be much better off just getting a 6-inch or 8-inch cruiser to sling HE or HC shells at the target. In fact, even the 5-inch 38 secondaries might do a better job at that stage, except and until an AP shell, which will easily get through the soil and to a certain degree the rock, gets into a cave or a tunnel, which theoretically could do, at least at the shallower ones, and blows it apart. The problem is actually doing so. So if the shells hit a Japanese tunnel or cave system, yes, they would be more effective than the HE shells, which sort of detonate nearby and don't really do all that much. But that's a very, 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 very big if, because whilst naval artillery fire is fairly accurate as far as big guns go, and you can see there's a big gunship on the bottom right of this picture, the fundamental problem is they are accurate in terms, especially at this kind of semi-point blank range, they are accurate in terms of very likely to hit another target which is several hundred feet long and several dozen feet tall. A tunnel or a cave is probably not even double-digit figures in height, and obviously they're not perfectly horizontal either. And if you don't actually know exactly where they are, you're not even strictly going to be able to aim at them particularly, just in their general vicinity, all of which conspires to make a direct hit pretty unlikely. Avalon asks, were the guns from the damaged USS Oklahoma installed on USS Pennsylvania in 1945 and used to get a few shots in at Wake Island, thus having Oklahoma in the battle, at least in a small way? Yes, as far as I can tell, it is a matter of record that Oklahoma's guns, or some of them, were refitted to Pennsylvania, and that refit predates her bombardment of Wake Island in 1945. In fact, she leaves her refit and heads over to join the front lines in the Western Pacific and stops by Wake Island for a bit of a shootout with the Japanese defenders. And since there's no real reason for her not to use a significant portion of her main battery in this event, then yes, she would have used some of Oklahoma's guns in that battle, which, yes, technically means a small part of Oklahoma did engage in the Pacific War. This photo, of course, is Pennsylvania bombarding Guam a little bit earlier in her career, although not too much earlier, not her shooting up Wake Island, but you get the kind of image. 22NF2 asks, what are good books/authoritative resources on the naval history of British Malaya and Borneo in World War I and World War II? I think, well, you're going to have to either Discord message me or email me or something, because when you're, well, very quickly, World War I in Malaya and Borneo are pretty boring. About the only significant naval item of interest that happens in the area in World War I is For Malaya is Emden showing up and shooting up a Russian cruiser and then leaving. But for World War II, there are two completely different strands of naval warfare in and around that area. One of which is, of course, right at the beginning of the Pacific campaign when Japan invades and occupies them. And then you fast forward right to the very end into 1945, which is when the Allies collectively come in and kick the Japanese back out again. And whilst there are a number of good naval histories of the Pacific War generally, which will touch on them, due to the nature of covering the Pacific War from end to end, they can only touch on them very briefly. So for history, good resources on the naval elements of the Malaya and Borneo campaigns of the Japanese and the Allies respectively, you're going to need to look for publications that look specifically at the very beginning of the war, ideally the very beginning of the war in the Southeast Asia area, and then flip to the other end, and you're going to need to look for resources, again, looking very specifically at the end of the war, and ideally the end of the war in the Southeast Asia area. And those are two very different tranches of literature. So, one, the other, or both, let me know, and I can make the appropriate recommendations. Although, especially for the latter part, given the heavy involvement of Australian troops, the Australian War Memorial and their associated publications are actually really good to go to. Something I appreciated even more than I did before after visiting Australia is that between the Australian War Memorial and various Australian historians, there is a remarkable amount of military history. I mean, from World War I and World War II and other surrounding areas, but especially from the Second World War, and including specifically for my interest, naval history, which has been written about quite a lot by Australian authors, but their work doesn't really seem to escape the continent very often. I came back with a suitcase that was half full of books that I'd picked up, and there are more still that I had marked down as wanting to pick up, only to discover that apparently the only way to pick them up on this side of the planet is to buy them and have them shipped from Australia, at which point I might as well have just stuck them in a suitcase back there, which I didn't realise at the time. So, yeah, definitely for the second part, look for Australian publications. But, as I say, message me and we can talk specifics. Kra F1 asks, how significant was loss of speed during combat manoeuvres for steam and steel ships? Did navies take this into account when designing ships, and what design decisions affected this? So the picture here, in case you're wondering, is Emperor of India in 1918 undergoing inclination and rolling tests. So don't worry, she's not sinking. So she's not actually turning in this picture, but you'll see why I've chosen this one a little bit later on. Now, when it comes to the loss of speed during combat maneuvers, this is a very significant factor because obviously ships take a while to build speed back up again. So if you put a ship into a hard maneuver in the middle of combat and you lose a lot of speed, potentially you're making yourself a sitting target, and any advantage you might gain from the maneuver you might then lose if, say, you drop a third of your speed. That might then give your enemy a chance to use their continuous speed to either regain a position they just lost, or to maneuver, if their ship doesn't lose quite as much speed in turns, to maneuver in such a way as to get itself into a position that actually is even worse for you. All sorts of things like that. Plus, it can also throw your formation out, because if you have a formation where, say, you have 2 or 3 battleships of one class, and they lose, again, arbitrarily, a third of their speed, and thus slow down quite a bit during a turn. But say the class of ships behind them only loses 10% of their speed in a turn, then you're going to end up with them all bunching up, potential collisions. It's also going to affect the radius, and obviously if the ships that lose less speed are ahead, then potentially they could end up spreading out from the ships that are losing a lot of speed. So that having not necessarily exactly the same characteristics, but a vague margin of characteristics is very important if you want ships to operate together in a fleet. Of course, for some navies, like the US Navy when it's designing the Standard class, this kind of performance characteristic is even more important because they're supposed to all operate uniformly, which, you know, it has its advantages and disadvantages as time goes on, as we've discussed in other questions. So yes, it was taken into account, but it wasn't a primary factor. It was something that, you know, if there was an extreme one way or the other, so it, you know, somehow a ship retains almost all its speed in a turn, this is really good, as long as that doesn't mean the ship has the turning radius of a small country, versus if a ship has a huge amount of speed loss in its turn, then maybe that's something you need to try and mitigate. But if that mitigation comes at the expense of something considered more important, like firepower or speed or armament, you know, armament as in the secondary battery or torpedoes or something, not the main armament, which would be the firepower element, or a ship's protection, then those would generally take priority. And in terms of design decisions that affect this, there's a lot. I mean, the length to beam ratio is one. Their stability in terms of rolling is another. Both of those will have a significant effect on how much speed they lose in a turn. Even things like the placement of propellers and rudders can affect how much speed you lose in a turn and how quickly you regain it. And all of this can actually have some really weird impacts on naval history, not just in the more common things you might think of, but in terms of how you are perceived by your opponent. Now, obviously, in the aftermath of the Battle of Jutland, both sides made some rather inflated claims about how many enemy ships had been damaged or destroyed. Partly based on propaganda, just inflating things, partly based on mistaken sightings, and partly based on actual good faith interpretations, but which were related to what they would expect to see rather than what necessarily the enemy ship performed by. And that's the last bit, is kind of, in a certain way, why Emperor of India is up here, because of course, if you look at Emperor of India and you just saw this photo, you might think, oh, has she been heavily damaged? Has she hit a mine? Well, there's a tug right there, so clearly there's some form of distress going on. You know, people up on deck, you know, maybe they're evacuating the ship. But then I tell you, actually, no, this is all part of planned inclination trials. And suddenly it makes sense, but it's nothing like what you might have initially expected. And this is where Jutland comes in with speed and loss of speed during combat maneuvers. German capital ships, especially the earlier ones like the Nassaus and the Helgolands, tended to lose quite a bit of speed and roll quite heavily in turns, especially when they're making very sharp turns, far more than British ships would. And so during Scheer's first battle turn away, and some of the later maneuvers as well, but particularly during the first one, what you had was the German fleet obviously doing a 180 and disappearing, but from the British perspective, they were seeing their shells occasionally hit, and as I've discussed in previous dry docks, because those shells quite often were detonating prematurely, they'd see fairly large explosions and pools of smoke compared to what they're expecting if the shell had punched through. And not knowing that their shells are malfunctioning, they're concluding that, shell, we've seen the shell hit, we've seen a really big explosion, a big column of smoke, they must have hit something really vital deeper in the ship for that amount of fire and explosion to get out of the hole in the ship. So great, we've hit them really hard. And then you combine that with, shortly thereafter, the ship turns away, you see it heel over much, much more than you would normally expect, because you've usually been observing what Royal Navy ships would do in a sharp turn like that. And you notice their speed dropping quite significantly. Well, your mind is going to put two and two together and come up with duck and conclude that clearly these ships are heavily damaged, listing and losing power and going down. And that's exactly what you see in some of the immediate post-battle reports at Jutland, when the British ships say, well, we hit this German battleship and it was observed to turn away whilst listing heavily and significantly losing speed. This was not propaganda per se. This was an honest observation by the gunners and the spotting officers on the British ships, but it was conflating how they expected a British ship to act in that kind of manoeuvre, and so overlaying that on what they were observing on a German ship, which you then combine with the slightly false impression of these early detonating shells, and you can see how they genuinely thought, well, we've seen a massive shell impact, and shortly thereafter this ship turns away, so they're retreating, they're wallowing really badly, they're rolling really badly, and they're moving really slowly when they come out that turn. Well, obviously we must have really badly hit their engines or something like that, and a ship that is immediately going into wallowing and slowing down within minutes of being hit by a shell with such spectacular results, it can't be long for this world, so it must have sunk off in the mist. When actually, of course, none of that had actually happened. It was just the German ships lost speed and rolled a lot more than British ships did. And so you get these weird reports. So that little anecdote, I think, gives you some idea of one of the weirder significances of different performance characteristics across navies for this particular paradigm. CJ Knoll asks, Drac, it's my understanding you have an engineering background and are familiar with metallurgy and material science. That's correct. Based on that, could you answer what has improved and how much from World War II to the present? So would modern Class A armour be significantly better than historical World War II Class A, for example? And B, assuming modern metallurgical knowledge and ability was superimposed into the pre-World War II period, say 2020 knowledge going back to 1930, would much change? Now, that's actually a really interesting one, because our ability to make battleship armour has actually pretty much disappeared, not because we've forgotten how, we have all the records, etc., but because, shockingly, the demand for foot-plus thick slabs of incredibly high-quality face-hardened steel has somewhat diminished in the aftermath of the demise of armoured fighting vessels, and there's not a huge amount of other industrial applications for that particular kind of, treated metal, which means that the specific skill sets and the specific foundries and equipment needed to make battleship face-hardened armour steel have pretty much disappeared. We could reconstruct the capability and retrain, but it would take quite a lot of time and money to do so. As I say, so it's one of those things of it's technically we couldn't do it anymore, but also we could if we could be bothered to spend a stupid amount of money on reinventing it. Now, that aside, yes, with modern materials we could make better face-hardened steel armour than they had historically, but significantly better? I think the word significantly would be carrying a lot of pressure at that point, because the way we could improve face-hardened armour using modern knowledge would be twofold. Firstly, and since you use Class A, I'm going to specifically pick on it. Firstly, because now we know what the varying thickness is in terms of what percentage of the plate was face-hardened versus what percentage of the plate was quote-unquote soft, and how deep the transition zone was, we now know that detail for all the different armour manufacturers of the period, and we know which proportion of face hardening to softer metal and which degree of transition is the most effective. And spoiler alert, it wasn't Class A. We could therefore alter the depth to match the ideal for the specific use, and so we would be taking Italian practices of varying the depth combined with the precise ratios from other navies like the Royal Navy for battleship armour, and actually for the US Navy might as well keep the depth for cruiser grade armour. So we'd be applying that to the Class A armour, and that in and of itself, even without changing the materials in the slightest, would actually make the Class A armour somewhat more effective. The other aspect would be modern steel alloys. Well, steel is an alloy, but when I say steel alloys, I mean blending steel with trace elements. Now, we do know, obviously, by World War II, the blending of certain trace elements in certain nations with their armour had resulted in an improvement in baseline armour physical properties beyond Class A regular steel anyway. So we could make a backing element which is tougher, basically harder to tear apart whilst retaining its ductility, and we could make a hardened face that is even harder, even more likely to shatter and break up an incoming projectile through a mixture of modern treatment methods and slight variances in the trace elements that are being put into the steel. But I think you'd be surprised that the percentage improvement isn't going to be kind of high double digits or anything like that. It is going to be a relatively incremental improvement unless and until you go into some really weird, really high-end stuff, which we can do. We haven't done in the realms of armour, but we have done in terms of things like designing turbine blades for jet engines and stuff. Some of that technology could be also applied to the development of battleship armour technology. But at that point, you would be entering the realm of incredibly niche processes that would cost an absolute fortune to do. So it would be one of those things that is technically plausible, but realistically completely impractical. So within the realms of known advances in metallurgy, which could be within reasonable cost applied to the improvement of battleship armour, it would be a combination of those material improvements plus the differences in the face-hardened layer and transition layer depths, which combined could make a decent improvement over World War II Class A. But it's not going to be twice as light and twice as strong kind of thing. It's going to be very high end, but most of it would technically be within reach of 1930s armour manufacturers if they knew about it. So if the knowledge you suggested in the second part of the question was ported back. Would much have changed? Well, potentially yes, actually, because whilst I say that the change wouldn't be as much as you might otherwise think, it would still be a relatively significant change, which would mean that essentially either if you looked at some of the more heavily armoured warships of the Second World War, either they could retain their existing thickness of armour but become equivalent, significantly better protected, which would be a real problem for anybody they came across, or you could retain the similar level of protection with less weight, which means you could distribute that weight elsewhere, perhaps upgrading the deck armour, more guns, higher speed, all those other wonderful things that people do. Or you could extend the equivalent level of protection over a wider area and thus make more of the ship protected. And there's a lot of different choices you could make. So yes, things would change, but exactly how, I think, would depend very much on how the specific Navy in question chose to use that information. Dave Collier asks, did the Great Hurricane of 1780 significantly affect the naval aspects of the American Revolutionary War? Did the disproportionately large losses for the Royal Navy compared to the French Navy help the American-French victory in the Yorktown campaign of 1781? Sort of. The two biggest British losses were a couple of ships of the line, and then a bunch of frigates also were lost, and various others were damaged. French ships took a fair bit of damage as well, but only one of them, a frigate, was lost as a direct cause of the Great Hurricane. However, you have to look at where the damage was caused. It's almost entirely in the Caribbean. So in that local theatre, I think, yeah, you probably could argue that the losses the Royal Navy suffered compared to the French helped the French gain a temporary ascendancy in that particular theatre. The Battle of Fort Royal, shortly after the hurricane, for example. If the British had had another couple of ships of the line to throw into the mix, could they have turned it into a victory? Yes, potentially. That could have been a thing. This is the kind of the weird thing is the split means that that's probably the only one you can really point to in terms of a major battle, because once you get to further battles later on, the British either win them anyway, like the Battle of the Saints, and or there are other factors involved which go beyond just, quote-unquote, 2 ships of the line, especially because once you get much beyond the Battle of Fort Royal, there's been more than enough time for the British to reallocate ships to replace those which have been lost. But, of course, you could then argue that the need to reallocate ships to the Caribbean to ensure later victories meant that those ships may therefore not have been allocated to the direct North America station, which then in and of itself may have contributed to things like the Battle of the Chesapeake, Battle of Virginia Capes, whatever you want to call it, which obviously had a very significant effect on the Yorktown campaign. Or you could treat the two theatres as entirely separate and conclude that it had no effect on the Yorktown campaign. But essentially the problem that you come across is how many steps down the line are you willing to take it? Because as I said, you could make a fairly strong argument the Battle of Fort Royal was quite strongly influenced by the disproportionate losses caused by the hurricane. But every step you get beyond that, you are making an assumption, which very quickly you're making an assumption based on an assumption, based on an assumption, based on an assumption, each of which is a potential divergence point. So the further on you go, the less steady the ground is. I would say that to argue that the hurricane is having a specific effect in the area where the British end up losing the American War for Independence. But you could construct that line, as I just mentioned, with ships being diverted to reinforce the Caribbean, meaning the ships aren't sent to North America, which results in the Yorktown campaign going awry. But that's only one possible interpretation, because, of course, the ships that were dispatched to the Caribbean may never have been intended for the North America station. The Royal Navy might have concluded the North America station had enough ships anyway. John McCarthy asks, Beatty gets a great deal of criticism for his actions and mistakes at the Battle of Jutland, and well deserved in my opinion. How should he have acted instead, and how might that have changed the battle's outcome? I realise this could be a very long answer, so maybe limit it to the most important 2 or 3 factors. Okay, if you want me to limit it for 2 or 3 factors, I think I can probably do that. So, first would be, if Beatty wants to think himself the second coming of Nelson, he should act like it. And that means taking all his captains and subordinate admirals into his confidence before any battle takes place. So that means rather than near enough, not quite, but almost ignoring poor old Admiral Evan Thomas and 5th Battle Squadron in the run-up to Jutland, when 5th Battle Squadron arrives, he should have arranged a conference with all the captains of all the battle cruisers, and I said all these subordinate admirals, and said, look, this is my plan. If we go and find the German battle cruisers, this is what I want us to do, and in the absence of any orders from me, this is kind of the general fighting principles I want you to follow. I give everyone a clear idea of what the heck is going on. There's the obvious easy throwaway of replace Seymour with someone who can actually do flag signals properly, but I think that's so much of a gimme that I don't think that really necessarily counts, so we're still only on one factor. The second thing I would do would be to change the order of the battle cruiser squadron, because he's been given the most powerful battle squadron in existence at that point in 5th Battle Squadron. And okay, they're not as fast as the rest of the battle cruisers when they're going flat out, but they're still pretty quick on their feet. And as you actually see looking at the reports from the run to the south, quite often during that whole run, neither side was actually going full pelt anyway. So what I would have done in Beatty's position is to take 5th Battle Squadron and say, right, you are now the vanguard. Put 5th Battle Squadron at the front, then have Lion and its unit in the middle, and the other battle cruisers right aft. Now, this means 2 rather important things. One is Beatty is now in the heart of his formation, which mean that his signals, ideally with a better signals officer, are going to be much, much easier for everyone to see and interpret. And secondly, it means that the most vulnerable ships, you've effectively organised your ships in order of vulnerability, roughly speaking, because you're going to have the 15-inch ships up front, you're going to have most of the 13.5-inch ships in the centre, and the end, where you're going to have Indefatigable and New Zealand, for example. Now, obviously, you would have to have a contingency plan in place just in case the Germans put the pedal to the metal and decide to skedaddle out of town. A prearranged signal that would allow 5th Battle Squadron to pull out of line slightly to let the Splendid Cats pile through at full speed. But that's one specific scenario that you can, as I said, make a plan for. In this scenario, therefore, when everyone knows roughly what BT wants them to do, what his command style is going to be like, and hopefully can read his signals a bit more clearly, when the battle cruiser fleet meets up with the first scouting group, you're now going to have a 2-to-1 advantage, approximately speaking. Obviously, factoring in firepower and stuff might change the precise odds, but effectively that. And the German ships are going to face having to fight it out with 5th Battle Squadron primarily, and then the 13.5-inch battle cruisers, and they're not really going to have much time at all to pay attention to Indefatigable, New Zealand, and one or possibly even two of the other 13.5-inch ships, simply because there's much more to worry about up front. Now, this has a number of effects. One, the weakest ships are basically far less likely to get hit, which means Indefatigable is much, much less likely to explode. Secondly, because of the sheer numbers, far more of the British ships are going to be unengaged, which means they essentially have practice shoot conditions. You also have far more rangefinders, including some of the more modern rangefinders on the QEs, looking at the situation. So the mistake that's made in estimating range to the targets is less likely to happen. And of course, the QEs are in the best place to exploit that in the first place, which means the German ships take more hits on their way in, which contributes to their troubles even more. And so generally the run to the south will go far, far better. It's much less likely that British ships will be lost, and it's much more likely that German ships will be lost. And if everyone knows roughly what BT is planning and how he wants to organise this battle, it's much more likely that people will be on the lookout for his signals and act appropriately. The final element to this, of course, would have been that BT really needs to grow a brainstem about what he's actually there to do. He's not there to destroy the entire German high seas fleet or the first scouting group on his own. He's there primarily as a gigantic glorified scouting force. But of course, if he has the situation well under control with the QEs happily blasting everything in sight, he's also got far more time and space in his head to, construct a clear and coherent report of what exactly is happening and signal Jellicoe, which not only means the first scouting group suffer much more of mauling on the run to the south, but Jellicoe will be kept far, far better informed of what the first scouting group and then the high seas fleet as a whole is doing, which in turn means that whilst Jellicoe pulled off something of a tactical masterstroke, he can pull off even better of a tactical masterstroke in terms of setting a trap for the high seas fleet, which might then result in even more damage, which might then result in less argument over who won. Ibareg asks, why were Italian frogmen generally more successful than their Japanese counterparts, despite the fact that the Japanese arguably had more advanced equipment for these kind of attacks? Well, I'm not personally aware of significant operations by Japanese Special Forces diving units, similar to the Italian 10th Flotilla units, which obviously famously damaged Queen Elizabeth and Valiant and kept plaguing Gibraltar and so on and so forth. I am aware of the Japanese plans for kamikaze divers at the end of World War II, but in terms of the kind of special forces raids, attach mines to enemy ships and withdraw to watch them explode, I'm not aware of wide-scale Japanese attempts at that. If this is an element of naval history that I've missed, then someone please enlighten me, tell me who these people are so I can go research them. But on the basis, well, you can look at it from two ways. On the basis that you're talking about the Japanese kamikaze diver units at the end of World War II? Well, the reason that they didn't really have much success is because they weren't actually deployed, and the reason their equipment might have been a little bit more advanced in some cases would have been, well, the Japanese have had another couple of years to develop it. But if there were Japanese diving units that were trying to do the similar kind of attach limpet mines and withdraw that the Italian 10th Flotilla were doing, I think the single biggest issue would be distance, because with the Italian efforts, they are obviously, when they're going up, and well, Alexandria and Gibraltar, the two opposite ends of the Mediterranean and about as far from Italy as you can get in the Mediterranean, is still a relatively close thing. You know, you can come up with all sorts of fancy equipment like the little underwater, not quite human torpedoes, but torpedo-shaped human propulsion devices, and so on and so forth. You can load them onto the back of a submarine. You can send that submarine out. They can disembark with all sorts of supplies and do their thing. Whereas when you look at the Pacific, yes, the Japanese do have some very, very long-range submarines and very large submarines that could, in theory, pull it off. But the sheer size of the Pacific means that the concentration of potential targets is very much lower. And because these things are kind of sitting in a very, very kind of splendid isolation, it actually makes defending them much easier. Because remember, Alexandria is not just dealing with the British Mediterranean fleet, for example, and Gibraltar is not just dealing with Force H. They're also still very, very busy commercial ports, which provides a degree of cover and plenty of targets if you're an Italian frogman. Whereas for the Japanese, something like Ulithi, or Espiritu Santo, etc., whilst there are cargo ships arriving, they're almost exclusively military cargo ships, because those ports are almost exclusively military ports, which means security is going to be a lot tighter and there's a lot less cover to slip in. And once you actually get in, if indeed you manage to, almost every target is going to be guarded to a military level, which is going to make getting an approach in a lot more difficult than, say, in Gibraltar, where there's a bunch of merchant ships. Alternate historian Turtle Duck asks, how were the B-24 and other four-engine heavy bombers used to close the mid-Atlantic gap? I've read many books regarding how the bombers helped to close the gap, but they fail to go into much detail. Essentially, it comes down to two things, range and payload. The Liberator was able to carry up to 6 depth charges by weight, potentially more at shorter distances. But more importantly, it could carry depth charges. A lot of early coastal command aircraft couldn't. And later on, when you got things like the Sunderland and the Wellington coming into service, which could carry depth charges, but well, the Liberator could carry more of them and go further, or carry a similar number and go even further still. And it's the range element that really comes into play, because with a payload, you could carry a slightly fewer depth charges, but also fit all sorts of fancy radar and even ley lights and things, some of which you can see here on these coastal command Liberators. But the main thing was range, because the mid-Atlantic gap was caused by a lack of range on aircraft. A lot of coastal command aircraft just flat out could not make the crossing of the North Atlantic, whether they took off from bases in England, Scotland, or even Iceland. They just flat out would never make it even to the most northeastern portions of Canada before they ran out of fuel. And that would be if they were flying dead for Canada. Assuming, of course, they're carrying actual payloads that make it in any way, shape, or form useful. Now, whilst the Wellington could, in theory, just about scrape it to Canada from the UK and make a few other Canadian landfalls more comfortably from Iceland, it would still be expending the vast majority of its fuel just making the crossing, which means that patrolling, where of course you're circling around or going back and forth like you're mowing a lawn, would be almost out of the question. Patrolling from Iceland to the Canadian East Coast, for example, the Wellington could in theory do that, but its patrol time would be extremely limited, because you'd essentially be using up maybe 300 to 500 miles worth of fuel which would be maybe 20% of your fuel. So if you're using 80% of your fuel just to get from point A to point B and 20% to actually patrol, your patrol time is going to be short, your patrol area is going to be limited. And, if you've been flying along and somebody says, well, actually, we've detected there's a U-boat 300 miles back the way you came, you're just not going to have the fuel to do that if, say, you're 2/3 of the way through your flight. Whereas with the B-24s, they had much more range than even a Wellington, and this meant, especially if you flew them from Canada to Iceland, or Iceland to the UK, or various permutations thereof, and later on using the Azores as well, it meant that these aircraft could comfortably go from one place to another, but they also had more than enough fuel reserve to spend sometimes hours patrolling back and forth, or doubling back, or whatever else you wanted them to do. And that meant that you actually finally had an aircraft that could meaningfully patrol over the mid-Atlantic, which previously, because obviously all the other aircraft that either flat out couldn't practically do that trip, would have to go out. They would have to then have a meaningful amount of fuel for their patrol, and then enough fuel to get home. So, for example, for a Wellington, it could maybe go out 800 miles, let's say, do a meaningful patrol, and then come back again another 800 miles. So 1,600 miles, and at that point it's still using only about 40% of its fuel load on patrol. Whereas a Liberator could go out considerably further, do a quite extensive patrol, and come back to base. And then you could have other Liberators that were going, say, from Canada to Iceland or back and again, who could do a certain amount of patrolling over the middle of the Atlantic, and that meant all of a sudden no area within the Atlantic was completely out of reach of aircraft. Combine that with HFDF and various intelligence decryptions like at Bletchley Park and so on, telling them roughly where the U-boats were. It meant you could have a Liberator on station merrily patrolling, and then they could get a quiet message, well, but we think there are some U-boats a couple of 100 miles away from your position. You should go and check that out. And a Liberator, of course, can get to that position within an hour, which is far, far faster than the U-boats would ever think anyone was going to show up. And that is essentially the start of the closing of the Mid-Atlantic Gap. The other big thing is, of course, escort carriers. Paul Pimblott asks, if you were asked to produce a Naval Band of Brothers style TV show, which ship or era would you choose for the show, and why? For that kind of thing, I think there are a few candidates you could pick from the Age of Sail, and there are some you could pick from the Second World War. The thing is, for a Band of Brothers style show, you need to have a conflict that lasts long enough to have a fairly significant arc to it, with enough individual actions, ideally directly reflecting historical occurrences, or at least very closely following, in order to get a meaningful series out of it, because a short war won't get you enough of an arc, and a longer war where perhaps there isn't a huge amount of varied action could become boring, or if there's not a huge amount of action period, you might have just one or two standalone bits, or you're going to have to delve very heavily into fiction. So the First World War, for example, probably isn't necessarily the best choice, because there aren't that many capital ship scale actions, so following a capital ship probably isn't going to work out. And whilst there are considerably more small ship actions, you're not, if you look at someone like, say, Cunningham, he spends an awful lot of World War One. Although he takes part in some fairly notable things, he does miss other notable things. So he misses Jutland because he's over in the Mediterranean, for example. But that means he does take part in Gallipoli. But it also means he misses out on a lot of the more exciting stuff that happens with the Dover Patrol and the Harwich Force. But then he also gets involved in some of the entertaining stuff right at the very end of the war, and round and round and round it goes. So you could invent a set of people who perhaps got involved in a whole mix of them, which would give variety as well as an arc to the show, but then you're perhaps going a bit too far off into the realm of fiction. So if I was going to do a naval Band of Brothers style TV show, I would either go Age of Sail and say follow Nelson, literally, because he has his often called Band of Brothers, the various captains and other officers who keep showing up in all or most of his various battles, all the way through from when he's just a lieutenant through to when he's just the captain of a single ship, through to the Battle of Trafalgar with all the intervening battles in between. That would definitely make an excellent Band of Brothers style TV show, which also has an excellent, obviously, climactic episode. Trafalgar, Nelson, the main character, dying, and then you can obviously do the little montage, Captain Samaras goes off to do this, Captain Hardy goes off to do this, and so on and so forth. The other one that would be really good from the Age of Sail would be Cochrane. Again, Admiral Lord Cochrane as the main character, following his arc. Now that would be really that'd be like a multi-series thing, because you'd have the early service arc, then his main arc on Speedy. Potentially Speedy would be the second half of season 1. Then he's got his other commands in the Napoleonic Wars of season 2, and then he goes wandering off to fight the Spanish in various other places in maybe series 3, and maybe it'd be a four series thing, maybe it'd be 3 series thing, but either way, and then of course you tail off with him being old and threatening to go full apocalypse on the Russians in the Baltic. And then, of course, if you wanted to do something a little bit more up to date, you could do USS Enterprise. USS Enterprise would make an excellent, if somewhat expensive to produce, I suspect, Band of Brothers style TV show, because she's in so many of the various engagements. There's probably 1 or 2 other US ships that you could pick for constant involvement in various operations in the Second World War. But if you're going to focus it in the European theatre, for example, then probably focus it on something like a destroyer, one of the destroyers that sees through pretty much the entire war. HMS Eskimo would probably be a really good one to do it on. Or possibly, if you just want to do a single mini-series with maybe half a dozen to a dozen episodes, then at that point I would possibly go as far as to suggest maybe you want to even do a mini series based on Warspite, because you could do half a dozen to a dozen episodes just on Warspite, starting off with first episode would be looking back, flashbacks to the Battle of Jutland and its interwar career, and then its modernization. Then perhaps episode 2, so that would be kind of almost a clip, not a clip show, but kind of a quick run through, if you like. And then you would meet up with your actual characters as the modernization completes, and then you'd be first going through the Spanish Civil War, then the opening phases of World War II, which would mean relocating from the Mediterranean, going into Norway, the last Battle of Narvik, all of that kind of good stuff. Then you're back in the Mediterranean, you've got Calabria, you've got Matapan, you've got all the other fun and excitement that Warspite's taking part in. And then as you get to the tail end of it, so the Mediterranean arc is probably going to occupy the central third or possibly more of your entire thing. And then as you get to maybe episode 8, you're going to be looking at 8 or 9 would probably be the Indian Ocean raid and what could have been there. Then you're going to go into, so maybe that's 8. Then 9 would be the operations off of Italy. So you're back in the Mediterranean, getting hit by that Fritz X would be definitely kind of the conclusion of that episode. Is it going to all end badly? Then perhaps episode 10 would be the repairs and the preparations for D-Day. Episode 11 would be D-Day itself. and the immediate aftermath, the general campaign off of northern France. And then episode 12 would kind of be from the post-Normandy invasion period to the end of the war, concluding with the ship defying it, the attempts to scrap it, and then gradually being broken up after going aground of its own volition, and that would be that. So, yeah, actually, having thought that through, I think Warspite would be my choice of any of them. Plus, of course, any self-respecting filmmaker would then have to build a set, possibly a 1-to-1 scale set, that represents large portions of Warspite, particularly the upper decks, a bit like the Japanese did for Yamato, a bit like James Cameron did for Titanic. At which point, once filming is over, well, someone's got to have a partial 1-to-1 replica of Warspite, don't they? Navy Lieutenant Retired asks, during the Battle of the Komandorski Islands on March 26, 1943, USS Salt Lake City went dead in the water, reportedly due to salt water in her fuel lines to the boilers because of a crew error whilst correcting battle damage. My questions are, how did this happen, or if it didn't, what actually happened, and how did they get water contamination in the fuel lines to all 12 of the boilers at the same time? Or otherwise, what actually caused the loss of steam to the engines? And since they regained steam and were underway in approximately 4 minutes, what did the boiler techs and repair party crew do to restore and relight the boilers so quickly? So yes, it did actually happen, but it's a combination of two main factors. Firstly, the hits that Salt Lake City was taking had led to flooding, which had completely ruptured or partially ruptured or allowed water intrusion into, from other compartments, several of the port side fuel tanks. So there was now salt water in the fuel tanks from which the boilers were drawing their fuel. Obviously, this is not helpful. Another factor was that the fuel lines themselves had become cracked and riddled with minor damage due to fragments and spalling and splinters and so forth. And in some of the parts of the ship where the fuel lines were running from the various fuel tanks into the boilers, those lines were now wholly or partially underwater from other flooding, which was coming up in the lower parts of Salt Lake City. And this led to a combination of factors. Firstly, of course, salt water was being pumped into the boilers along with the fuel, and salt water doesn't burn, so this was effectively cooling the fires and putting them out. And secondly, as you'll know, the fuel that's used, bunker fuel, is not exactly the world's freest flowing liquid in the first place. It's actually quite viscous, and you think of how far north this battle is taking place, the really cold water is further effectively congealing the fuel, so it's not coming in quite as quickly as the pump pressure would pump fuel regularly, and when it's spraying, it's not so much spraying as dribbling, and thus the fires die. However, this was presaged by the boiler fires beginning to splutter, and the people in charge of these kinds of things, they did actually realise, hang on a second, this is bad, we need to switch to taking fuel from other tanks, because although having the fuel lines themselves compromised, well, firstly, some of the fuel lines from other tanks will be separate, only joining up at the end, so the amount of fuel, seawater intrusion into the fuel lines will be significantly reduced, and also by taking from other tanks, the starboard side tanks, which are undamaged, the baseline fuel that's coming through will not be contaminated. However, and this is the bit that's always a little bit of a mystery, that order's given when the boiler fires start to sputter, and then someone somewhere, and the sources that I used for the battle still can't necessarily quite establish who, gave the order to switch the fuel back to using the port side tanks, and that led very quickly to the seawater in the fuel oil extinguishing all of the boiler fires. In terms of how they got everything moving again quickly, well, of course, just because you've extinguished the boiler fires doesn't mean that the latent heat in the boilers has gone away. So there was still some heat being generated and some steam being generated by the boilers, just not a huge amount. And obviously, even once steam production stops, for all practical intents and purposes, and the ship rolls to a halt because there's no longer enough power to move the turbines, there is still a fair amount of latent heat in the boilers, which means that if you can relight them, they're going to pass the point of generating enough steam pressure to get the turbines moving again pretty quickly. And that's essentially what happens. Within a minute or two of the boilers flaring out, the guys down in trying to deal with the problem realized that whatever made that decision, it's not going to last, because apart from anything, if the engines are down, and that means a lot of power is down, then the main pumps aren't going to save us because the flooding's coming in quite quickly. So essentially what they order is, screw it, we are taking fuel from the starboard tanks regardless of what anybody else says. It takes about a minute or so for the pumps, but once the switchover is made, for the pumps to show actually we're now getting decent oil. The last bits of water-contaminated thick oil are being purged from the system, and then they can start getting the boilers back going again, because now you've got good oil spraying into the boilers. You essentially light them off again, but as I said, you've got the latent heat from the previous fires going, so very quickly steam pressure builds back up and Salt Lake City is able to get underway again. And of course, much to their delight, once full power is back online, that means all the pumps are back online to full pressure again, and the water that's flooding the engine rooms, etc., starts to go down. And well, that's the first half of Drydock 283 over and done with. On to the second part.